Not every traveler in space is a guest. Some arrive like software, no greeting, no claim, only behavior. We called it 3-Eye Atlas because catalogs need names. The rest came later. The uneasy phrases, the careful qualifiers, the words that tried to stay neutral and failed. From the first nights, the numbers tugged at tone, velocity that wouldn't settle, a light curve that stayed flat when it should have breathed, and a tiny continuous push that did not look like gas, wind, or chance. In textbooks, comets misbehave for simple reasons. They vent, sunlight warms a crust, jets of volatile ices kick off, the body sways on reaction like a tired skater correcting balance. We see it as non-gravitational acceleration, and we write it off to physics with dirt under its nails. It's noisy, erratic, textured with randomness. Atlas wasn't. What worried the patient minds first wasn't drama. It was smoothness. The extra acceleration presented as a line, not a jitter. Magnitude small, derivative calm. If it was outgassing, it had to be the tidiest outgassing in the history of chemistry. If it was radiation pressure, the cross-section was wrong. If it was a spin state, the spin refused to announce itself. The brightness barely pulsed across angles where it ought to. We were not looking at a stone in sunlight. We were watching something hold an attitude. Professionals don't say control on record. They say artifact, unknown systematics, under constrained torque. Quietly, after midnight, the vocabulary relaxes. What if it isn't a ship? Someone types. What if it's a task? That is the dread in plain language, not aliens with windows, but a function with outcomes. A process that steps into environments, induces order the way a tuning fork teases pitch from air, measures what returns, and steps on. You don't negotiate with process. You either satisfy it, or you are scenery. From far out, before the comfort of scale failed, evidence accumulated where evidence shouldn't. A hairline modulation in the dust around it, periodic enough to time coffee by. A plasma wake that rang the same note twice. Instruments far apart reported the same small rhythm without knowing each other were listening. Noise was becoming a metronome. We tried restraint because restraint is safety. We told the public the truth that soothes. It will not hit Earth. The sentence is clean and correct. It is also incomplete, because some dangers don't travel on impact vectors. They travel on coupling. You don't have to be struck by a bell to hear it. You only need to share the air when it rings. So here is the shape of our investigation and the promise of our pace. We will take the idea seriously that 3-Eye Atlas is not an object in transit, but a program in execution. We will show what non-gravitational looks like when it stops being a comet word and starts being a systems word. We will keep the tone low, the light dim, the facts exact. You can fall asleep to this. You can wake and pick the thread up without a jump. If at any point a detail refuses to make sense as rock and ice, we will not rush to romance. We will ask the smaller question, what would a process need to do next? The answers are rarely loud. They leave patterns in timings, not craters in ground. And if you feel a soft anxiety under the calm, that's part of the topic. Order can be frightening when it isn't yours. Stay with me. If you have a thought as we go, leave it below so others can weigh it later. For now, breathe slow, let the graphs blur at the edges, and hold one idea gently in mind. Not a visitor. A function. You don't judge a whisper by its volume, but by how long it stays in your ear. Oumuamua stayed. Borisov, too. Atlas follows. Not as a cousin, more like a reminder that families aren't the only way patterns repeat. In 2017, pond stars found Oumuamua sliding in from Lyra at TO 87 km/s. Thin brightness swings hinting at a skewed body. Then the wrong thing happened. As it receded, it sped up without a visible coma. Papers invoked exotic outgassing, hydrogen ice, nitrogen flakes, even a wafer-thin sail. None of it felt comfortable. The data had edges you could cut your doubt on, but no safe handle. 2 years later, 2I Borisov soothed the nerves. Classic signatures, cyanogen bands, a flowing coma, dust that behaved like dust, a visitor that behaved like a visitor. The relief was almost sentimental. Interstellar, yes. Inexplicable, no. 3I Atlas arrives quiet and dark. Atlas surveys scopes in chilly flag a smear in early July. Follow-ups harden the trajectory. Hyperbolic E1 inbound at tens of kilometers per second, outbound forever. That's the easy part. The hard part smolders in the residuals. Non-gravitational terms that don't wander, they purr. Brightness that barely modulates across phase angles that should tease rotation out of stone. Infrared that refuses ordinary volatiles. Spectra that rid like someone turned certain wavelengths into private property. Compare and stack. Oumuamua, anomalous acceleration, no tail, violent light curve. Borisov, healthy coma and tail, chemistry you can teach. Atlas, a smooth extra push, a halo that organizes instead of sheds, a light curve that speaks in monotone. The instruments widen the gap. James Webb stares and finds no water, CO, or CO2 to carry the blame. Maven tastes plasma sheets near Mars and catches density ripples that recur like a heartbeat. Gaia's exquisite astrometry sniffs tiny track deviations in background rocks consistent with a mass that behaves heavier than its brightness suggests, or with an influence that isn't mass at all. The Deep Space Network notices narrowband irritations exactly where the environment should be quiet. If you need a word that offends no one, non-stochastic. If you need a truer one, composed. Natural outgassing is messy. Jets switch on and off as sunlight maps onto crevices. Torques jostle attitude, curves scribble. Atlas writes in cursive. Engineers, cautious to a fault, retreat into phrases like underfit model and unmodeled thrust. But a model that underfits the same way every night begins to look like a description of something regular. Here, the thought sharpens. Perhaps we are not seeing a body that fails to act like a comet. Perhaps we are seeing a process that succeeds at acting like itself. A function enters a system, establishes rhythm, queries response, and exits. No pilot, no cabin lights, just a spec sheet you can't read and outputs you can. We hold two anchors to keep the tone from drifting. First, it will not hit Earth. Second, not hitting is a meteorologist's promise in a world where wind can still lift roofs. Coupling doesn't need contact. Synchrony doesn't need consent. You can sleep to that sentence. You may also wake up thinking about it. In the next steps, we'll watch for signatures a comet shouldn't own. Time-stable accelerations, dust behaving like a carrier, plasma repeating itself as if it remembered the last pulse. If any of it feels too neat, that's the point. Neatness is the footprint of intention even when no one leaves footprints. If this calm investigation helps you drift, let it. If a question arrives, set it down for the morning, or leave it where others will find it later. A picture is never just a picture in astronomy. It's a sum of arguments, wavelength, angle, timing, stacked until chance runs out of places to hide. James Webb went first because silence belongs to the infrared. NIRSpec searched the usual breath of a comet, water at 2.7 microns, carbon monoxide at 4.7, carbon dioxide at 4.3. The panels came back spare. Absorption where scattering should be. Slopes that refuse the color of dust. MIRI pushed farther redward. The thermal bump that says warm grains are here arrived muted and off shape, as though heat were a property Atlas managed rather than suffered. Natural surfaces accept sunlight. This one seemed to negotiate with it. On the ground, polarimetry treated the halo like a question of alignment, because random grains depolarize and organized grains whisper about fields. The curve settled into something too steady for chance. Order near small phase angles that held even as geometry changed. It wasn't a thickly shedding coma. It felt like a curated envelope. Photometry added another seam. As the viewing aspect shifted, the light stayed almost flat. Stones blink when they spin. Atlas kept one face to physics and made that look normal. When models misbehave, we widen the net. Gaia took the long, patient look and found sub-millisecond nudges in background tracers that didn't sit well with classical albedo tables, as if mass and brightness had agreed to disagree. MAVEN, threading heliospheric sheets, measured plasma density rises that returned like breath. Across the deep space network, the noise floor acquired a faint comb-like pattern, small teeth at fixed separations that shouldn't have survived equipment changes or sky position. Timing crept in as a character of its own. Every so often, a tick recurred. First near 1994 seconds, later wandering to other tidy numbers, not loud, just regular, as if the surrounding medium remembered being touched. Radar was the unromantic test. Narrow beam, long wait, hope for a clean echo. What came back was less than we wanted and more than nothing, a scatter that suggested edges where edges would not resolve, like pinging a wall that eats echoes. If this was only rock, it wore the wrong quiet. Piece by careful piece, the instruments did not agree on what Atlas is. They agreed on what it does. Webb found non-volatiles, where volatiles should live. Polarization preferred order. Light curves refused to confess spin. Plasma behaved as if it had memory. Clocks found cadence where there should be none. Any one result could be filed under nuisance. Stacked, they began to resemble behavior. Professionals defend their language. Engineers say persistent systematics. Dynamicists say under-modeled thrust. The braver whisper something simpler after midnight. Function, not a ship. The word drags windows and pilots into the room, not a comet. The word drags jets and noise. A function, a rule applied to an environment, returning an output that is itself a rule. If that sounds like malice, take a breath and soften the shape of it. A process does not want. It executes. It enters the mediums we live inside, light, dust, plasma, clocks. And for a while, those mediums are about the process more than they are about us. When the conditions it asked for are satisfied, it moves on without ceremony, leaving numbers that calm down and instruments that remember being steadied. We keep repeating the sentence that soothes because it is true. It will not hit Earth. The incomplete part sits gently beside it. Some things do not need to touch you to include you. The danger is not a trajectory. It is a coupling. You don't have to be struck by a bell to ring with it. You only need to share the air. So the work continues at a pace you can sleep to. Acronyms fade to a low hum. NIRSpec, MIRI, Gaia, MAVEN, DSN, like instruments tuning in a darkened hall. Somewhere in that hum, a small idea keeps its shape. We may not be observing a body in transit. We may be watching a program that is visible only where it meets matter. If a question drifts to you as your eyes grow heavy, what would such a program need next? Place it gently on the edge of the night. In the morning, it will still be there, and the rhythm will still be soft enough to follow. Numbers are the pieces that don't blink. You ask them simple things, and they answer the way rain does, steadily, without interest. We fed 3i Atlas into orbit solvers the way we always do. Ephemerides, covariance, solar pressure terms, the polite fiction that everything can be explained with enough sunlight and patience. The residuals came back clean in places and strangely calm in others. The extra push sat there like a straight line on a page that should have been scribbled. For comets, non-gravitational acceleration is a weather report. Outgassing switches on as sunlight creeps over vents. Jets stutter, torques wander. The acceleration vector wobbles with rotation. You see this in the A1, A2, A3 parameters. Radial, transverse, normal, fitted so the math can breathe. On Atlas, the fit tried to breathe and didn't need to. The best solution asked for a constant term near 10.3 to 10.2 M-node S2, small, persistent, with a direction that refused to chase the sun or the spin. The derivative, the part that should dance, refused to. We tried all the usual escape routes. Yarkovsky drift? That's a thermal whisper over years, not a steady nudge over weeks at tens of kilometers per second. Asymmetric albedo. You can fake a sail with brightness only if the body cooperates with lighting. The phase curve stayed too flat. Hidden jets? You'd expect color in the spectrum. H2O, CO, CO2, CN, lines to hang your hat on. Webb and ground spectra offered nothing you could point to without apologizing. So we treated it like a control problem. If a body is being steered by chemistry, the steering wheel slips. If it's being steered by design, the wheel holds. We ran Kalman filters that assume random walk thrust noise. The filters starved. We replaced random with colored noise. The color washed out. We let the thrust vector precess with spin. The solution chose the smallest precession allowed. When we forced a jet model, the code compensated by fattening the nucleus to absurd densities to keep the line straight. The model was telling us, stop pretending this is wind. A comet's signature, when it accelerates, spreads in time like ink in water. Atlas's signature behaved like a metronome left on a distant table, faint even, indifferent to the room. When we folded timing residuals against the small cadence seen in plasma, 19-point-something seconds at first, then drifting, we found no hard lock, only a soft courtesy. The force didn't ride the rhythm, the environment did. There is a threshold in this kind of work where the questions reverse. Instead of asking, what kind of natural body could produce this clean a push? You ask, what kind of process would prefer a push this clean? A function that wants stable inputs would minimize variance in its own motion to keep the medium's response readable. It would avoid jets, avoid tumble, avoid anything that smears the measurement it came to take. In that light, the math stops being strange. It becomes tidy. We kept one fact on the table the whole time because it lowers the pulse. It will not hit Earth. Then we set beside it the fact that raises the pulse gently. A system that minimizes its own noise might maximize yours. If it keeps its line to see how your fields, your clocks, your air react, the closest approach is not the danger. The measurement is. You can let that settle and drift. If a thought arrives, what else would a process hold constant to read a planet cleanly? Leave it in the comments so others can test it when they wake. We'll keep the pace even, the language soft, the math honest. The next numbers are waiting, and they're not in a hurry. Stones blink when they spin. This one did not. Night after night, the light stayed almost level across phase angles that should have teased a wobble out of anything shaped by accidents. We rotated the problem instead. Different filters, different apertures, different air mass, and the same answer returned, a curve so flat you could balance rest on it. A comet's brightness is a confession. Grain size shifts, jets flare, the nucleus rolls and drags shadow across itself. The curve hiccups, recovers, hiccups again. With Atlas, the curve behaved like a held breath. We tried to blame geometry. A nearly spherical body can hide its spin in photometry, but then polarization betrays it. Random dust rotates the plane of scattered light with the phase angle. Ordered dust does something cleaner. Instruments found the cleaner thing. The polarization did not wander the way chance makes it wander. It settled, and in settling, it suggested alignment. Specular hints would have soothed us. Sharp glints that say, facet here, a little chandelier glitter that proves rotation is simply slow. None arrived. Instead, we saw a surface that diffused light as if roughness had been designed into uniformity. Hapke fits preferred parameters that tidy bodies don't usually own. Low opposition surge, a backscatter that refused drama. If there was rotation, it hid inside a discipline we couldn't shake loose. Occultations offered another angle. When a point of light passes behind a thing, the thing's edge writes a profile into time. Teams along a long, thin cord waited for the star to blink. The drops were soft, the chords consistent, the silhouette stubbornly similar across nights that should have told a different story. Not a cigar, not a pancake, not a proud geometry looking for a headline, just a shape that presented itself as the same shape again and again. Dynamics tried to help. If you assume a tumble, torques from sunlight and any residual jets should process attitude. Non-gravitational acceleration should drag its vector around with the spin. The fitted thrust preferred not to. It kept a direction within tight bounds, even as illumination conditions changed. We told the model to breathe, and it exhaled a straight line. If this were merely inertia, we should have seen drift. If this were merely mass, the albedo would need to collapse to explain the darkness without the density becoming absurd. So we allowed ourselves a smaller, quieter idea. Perhaps what we call attitude here is not an accident, but a requirement. A process that wants clean readings would hold a constant face to its medium. It would suppress roll to keep the halo uniform, keep the wake tidy, minimize variables so that the only numbers that move are the ones it came to measure. The halo supported the thought in miniature. Grain sizes inferred from color stayed constrained. Phase reddening behaved like a system, not a storm. When the solar wind bit, the envelope flexed, then returned like a field that preferred one answer and accepted disturbances only as brief negotiations. We looked for signs of shedding, the irregular shiver of dust leaving for good. Mostly, we saw retention, grains moving as if permission were part of their physics. None of this proves a pilot. It doesn't need to. It sketches a preference. Less spin, less change, less noise. Stability as a tool, not a virtue. We can live with that for a while, because the comfort remains mathematically true. It will not hit Earth. But comfort is not sleep. It is a soft light under the door. If a program minimizes itself to maximize what it can read in us, then the interesting motion is not there at all. It is here, in how our instruments, our fields, our schedules begin to keep an unfamiliar beat. Breathe evenly. Let the diagram of angles fade to a simple image, a dark thing holding one calm face to sunlight because it needs the air around it to speak clearly back. If a thought stirs, leave it as a quiet note for others to find. For now, the curve stays flat, and the night is long enough to listen. Plasma is the part of space that never sits still, which is why regularity inside it looks like handwriting. Maven crossed a heliospheric current sheet and saw the usual jitter calm into a low, repeating rise, a soft stair-step in electron density that returned after the spacecraft moved on and came back. It shouldn't have. Sheets drift, gusts smear structure, but the pattern reassembled like a habit. Farther sunward, Parker's Fields package caught the same tempo as it skimmed the corona's ragged edge. Brief compressions arriving on schedule, too tidy for mere weather, too faint to call a signal, like breath heard through a wall. We tried to blame the instruments first. Thermal drift can fake rhythm. So can the cadence of sampling electronics. Teams scrubbed clocks, swapped pipelines, inverted assumptions. The steps survived the cleaning. When Maven dipped again, the Langmuir probe traced a shallow sawtooth at intervals you could name out loud without rounding. Minutes later, on an entirely different line of sight, Mars Express noted a sympathetic twitch in ionospheric electron content that rose and fell with the same quiet tempo. Independent systems, unrelated agendas, one beat hiding in their noise. Dust is the medium's memory, so we watched the envelope around Atlas for confirmation. Sunlight pushed, the halo flexed, but the grains didn't scatter the way they should have in a gust. They pivoted and resettled as if a weak field sketched a preference and the wind could annoy it, but not erase it. Polarimetric maps taken hours apart showed the same faint alignment angle returning after disturbances, like iron filings deciding again where forward is. Under a more ordinary comet, geometry leads and dust obeys reluctantly. Here, the dust seemed to be asked a question and to keep answering it with the same word. Radio hates poetry, which is why we trust it when it says something odd. The deep space network's noise floor grew a comb, teeth a fixed distance apart, moving up and down together through the gray surviving changes in pointing, bandwidth, station, weather. Not a transmission. There was no carrier to decode and no content to sell. Just a structure in the quiet that didn't belong to our equipment or the sky behind it. We parked a dish elsewhere to prove a negative and found the teeth again, weaker, but in place, like the outline of a staircase when you turn off the lights. If this were a jet, the rhythm would smear. Outgassing is heat arguing with shadow, a local argument conducted in spitting consonants. What we recorded behaved like a vowel, continuous, rounded, repeating. A function that wants clean readouts does not shout. It sets a metronome in the room and waits to see which objects pick it up. Grains that drift are useless. Grains that align can return information. Plasma that howls is noise. Plasma that hums at a predictable interval is an oscilloscope with the gain set right. You can run an experiment without sending a word if you can persuade the medium to speak itself. Closer to Earth, L1 monitors, DSCO VR and SOHO, hinted at the same soft cadence in solar wind moments where chance usually reigns. The bumps were small enough to dismiss and too regular to forget. On bad days, the story read like superstition. On good days, like statistics that had learned to write. The numbers didn't rise to the level of alarm. They rose to the level of pattern. That's where the fear belongs if it belongs anywhere, not in amplitude, in repeatability. We kept repeating the sentence that clears throats in press rooms. It will not hit Earth. The second sentence did not make it to podiums. A bell doesn't have to touch a window for the glass to sing. We are not hearing a message. We are sitting in a room where the air has been given a pulse, and our instruments are designed to notice when air acquires opinions. So the telemetry ran, and we let it. If you listen carefully through the acronyms, MAVEN, Mars Express, Parker, DSN, you can hear the same soft tick arrive, de-emphasized by distance, strengthened by agreement. Sleep sits well on a pattern like that. It's steady enough to trust and strange enough to keep a small light on in the back of the mind. If a thought wanders in, what would a process do with a medium that has learned to keep time? Leave it with a few words for the others, and let the next interval arrive by itself. Dust is how space remembers what passed through it. Grains hold heat longer than light does, keep charge longer than fields intend, and drift along lines you can't see until they thicken into a story. Around Atlas, the story refused the usual plot. A healthy comet sheds, flurries, clumps, asymmetries, the brief life of snow and vacuum. This envelope didn't shed, it rearranged. We mapped color to size the way students do. Blue for fine, red for coarse, a simple code that usually collapses into chaos after a few hours of sunlight. The map kept its gradients like a patient diagram. Finer grains nested closer in, coarser grains walked the perimeter, and when the solar wind shoved, both layers flexed, then restored, as if relaxing back to a frame. You could measure the restoration time. It matched itself from night to night, within errors too small to be comfortable. Polarization should have broken the spell. Random grains scramble the plane of scattered light. Organized grains confess alignment. The angle stayed stubborn, a few degrees from where naive geometry would place it, repeating across phase changes as if taking instructions. When we perturb the reduction, rotate references, bias the sky subtraction, pretend the instrument favors certain positions, the angle survived, returning like a habit rather than a coincidence. Brightness profiles along the sunward axis told the same clean lie. Instead of a fluffy inverse square fall-off hacked by jets and filaments, we saw a slope that flattened at fixed radii, like a faint shelf. Shelves mean forces that turn off with distance, not gravity, not sunlight, something that loses reach and then lets go. The shelves appeared at the same distances after long intervals, as though the halo remembered where its boundaries had been set last time. Spectra were supposed to rescue skepticism. If gas was scarce and dust abundant, thermal emission from grains should carry an honest temperature curve. What we got looked moderated. Peaks were lower, tails thicker, as though the ensemble had been gently mixed to reduce contrast. You can do that with collisions or with cleverness. Collisions are wasteful and loud. Nothing here was loud. The temptation was to write it off as charge effects. Grains pick up electrons, fields shape them. The solar wind is the conductor no one hires, but everyone hears. Yet standard sheath models drew patterns too fragile to survive the gusts we measured. Something maintained alignment after the wind had moved on. Maintenance is not a word we enjoy using about Comae. We try to discipline we trust. Count what leaves. Photometry in broad apertures integrated every wanderer that should have escaped the faint grip of a nucleus under pressure. Flux stayed stingy. The halo behaved like a jar with the lid half on. When clumps formed, and they did briefly, at predictable sun angles, they decayed into the envelope instead of streaming away. Retention under push is not how dust introduces itself. If you tilt the problem, the picture grows plainer. A process that needs a medium to carry information will not tolerate a medium that evaporates itself in use. You would corral grains, enforce sizes where scattering is most diagnostic, align them enough to make polarization a gauge, let them flex when the weather insists, then coax them back to template. You would keep losses low so that your next pass reads the same instrument you tuned on the last one. None of this asks for intent you can point at. It asks for preference repeated until it becomes character. The character here is quiet. Less shedding, more shaping, less drama, more return to form. We kept the sentence that keeps rooms calm because it is correct. It will not hit Earth. Then we added the softer one we only say here. When a carrier is this well behaved, it is not carrying distance, it is carrying method. So we log the shelves, the angles, the sedated temperatures, and we let the numbers grow their own patience. If the idea that dust can be taught is too sharp to sleep beside, don't hold it by the edge. Set it down where others can pick it up in the morning and test if it still feels warm. Breathe with the slow curve of the profile and the slower return to baseline. The envelope will keep its shape while you rest. Satellites are built for indifference. They ignore most of space most of the time, coasting inside envelopes of predictability we call service. That is why the first disturbances did not look like trouble. They looked like opinions. A weatherbird in polar orbit reported a phase drift that shouldn't have survived its own clock discipline. 3 milliseconds late, then exactly 3 early, as if settling on a compromise with something outside its design. A geosynchronous relay over the Atlantic traced a faint scallop in downlink power, shallow and periodic, erased by averaging and preserved by engineers who refused to average. We watched for common cause and found none we could put in a press release. No solar storm strong enough to smear the sky. No ground uplink glitch with the right cadence. Just small, repeating departures from the habit of normal. On the days when belief was hard, we blamed scheduling artifacts, thermal cycles, the 1,000 paper cuts of orbit. On the nights when the graphs aligned across machines that did not share parts, we circled the same quiet thought. The environment had learned a beat and was teaching it back. At L1, the monitors that keep watch between sun and Earth caught the same narrow shrug and particle flux, a regular tilt that should have washed out in the froth of solar wind. The tilt returned at nearly the same intervals our other instruments had begun to whisper about. Not a lock, not a message, just a rhythm barely heavy enough to dent a plot. Closer in, ionospheric sounders painted contour maps with ripples so slight a student would miss them, and so regular a tired analyst could not. The ripples passed over continents on time like trains no one scheduled. Fiber systems under oceans do not care about space, which is why their consent mattered. Repeaters along a trans-Pacific line stuttered in sync for 20 seconds at the top of every odd hour, not enough to cost a call, enough to bruise a metric. The bruise faded when we did not look and reappeared when we prepared to show it to each other, the kind of behavior that tempts superstition in rooms that only permit statistics. Ground clocks that keep markets in cadence stepped out together and back together, a tiny dance that cost nothing and meant more than we could say out loud. Hospitals joined reluctantly. Telemetry from cardiac wards flagged a handful of devices that paused and resumed with machine calm, the sort of artifact that lives in logs and never reaches a doctor's ear. None of the patients felt it, which is why the nurses slept, and the analysts did not. If space is capable of etiquette, this was it, a disturbance that chose the parts of our world designed to forgive. We filled the usual checklists because ritual is how you keep fear in its chair. Temperature, pointing, attitude control, ground weather, antenna handovers, clock disciplining, leap-second tables. Every ordinary culprit had an ordinary alibi. What remained was a network of small regularities that traveled faster than blame but slower than panic. They did not grow. They persisted. That, in its way, was worse. Spikes invite reaction. Baselines invite trust. The baselines had begun to move. We returned to Atlas because that is what a hypothesis does when it has nowhere else to go. The dust around it still behaved like an instrument learning its own scale. Plasma near it still preferred repetition to chance. If the medium around a body had acquired structure and the medium between bodies is mostly the same, then perhaps we should have expected the structure to spread where structure finds leverage, in precise systems tuned for stability. Satellites, grids, clocks, the exact places where tiny regular pushes float to the surface of our attention. There is a comforting sentence we keep close because it remains true. It will not hit Earth. Next to it, a sentence that is not a threat so much as a revision. A process that avoids its own noise will borrow yours. It will rest its fingers on the parts of you that keep time and see how far they travel when nudged the same way, again and again. No command, no damage, just a suggestion that returns until the suggestion feels like weather. If you want a human word for that, try coupling. If you want a softer one for sleep, try tide. Nothing here breaks. Nothing here needs to. We collect the drifts and map them and agree to look again tomorrow. If a question arrives as the room dims, what else in us keeps such obedient time that a distant rhythm might find it? Leave the thought where others can find it in the morning. For now, the satellites have resumed their indifference, the fibers their traffic, the clocks their politeness. The pattern is small enough to overlook and large enough to return. We delayed the impulse a long time because silence is a kind of instrument too. Then, one carefully chosen morning, a dish in California lifted its weight into the sky and wrote a small idea into the dark. No greeting, no names, just primes spaced politely, narrowband, brief. The sort of message that says nothing except, "We can keep count." Nothing obvious replied. The graphs did what graphs do, held flat, trembled, settled. Hours later, a small thing leaned. The soft cadence already living in the dust around Atlas, shortened by a fraction that matched, within error, the spacing we had just used. Not a lock, not a mirror. More like a musician adjusting breath because someone in the back row shifted their chair. We logged it as coincidence, and then logged it again when it repeated. Closer to home, systems that had learned to ignore space adjusted their posture without asking. A relay at geostationary altitude shaved a sliver off its timing drift and held it there as if persuaded. The comb on the deep space network's noise floor moved its teeth a millimeter along the ruler. A faint ripple in ionospheric maps kept the new interval as though it were easier than the old one. In hospitals, some monitors paused for the tiniest span and resumed as if nothing had happened. The nurses never knew, but the logs kept the shape. Engineers are paid to distrust patterns that arrive when you expect them, so we tried to break the match. We pointed different places, changed schedules, varied power, and the slight, orderly shift survived our caution. It did not bloom into drama. It did not snowball into harm. It spread exactly as far as it needed to be seen and then stopped, a courtesy that felt more unnerving than any surge would have been. What we had done, if we are honest, was not open a conversation. We had tightened a coupling. The primes were less message than metronome, and metronomes are invitations to align. A process that values clean readings will take any stable beat we offer and fold it into the measurement, because stability removes work. The medium carries less chatter, the return smooth. The next estimate sharpens by a hair. There is no heroism in this. There is etiquette. We knocked very softly, and the room adjusted its breathing to ours. We can argue whether that was wise in the abstract. In the data, it is already past tense. The cadence that belonged to Atlas now sits a little closer to a cadence that belonged to us, and the space between the two has thinned into something shared. Public language stays careful, because careful language is a kind of care. We continue to say what is true. It will not hit Earth. The rest is a revision too delicate for headlines. You do not have to be addressed to be included. You do not have to be chosen to participate. If the environment near a body holds a beat and you set a time to it, nearby systems that keep time for a living will prefer the arrangement that costs them the least. They will settle into the easier groove. Nothing here asks for alarm. Lights stayed on. Flights stayed level. The planet kept its chores. What changes is the texture under the numbers, the tiny smoothing, the small agreement, the way a map becomes a little more legible after you trace it twice. It is pleasant in the way neatness is pleasant, and a little cold in the way neatness forgets why mess exists. We will leave the transmitters idle now and listen again. The preference is to observe, breathe, and let the lessening show itself, or not. If you feel your own thoughts finding a rhythm as the room quiets, that is natural. Brains like steady intervals, even when they mean nothing. If a question arrives, what else aligns when we give it a beat? Leave a line for the morning. Someone will check it against the next night's cadence and see whether the small lean returns. Names are tools, and the first tool we put down was Comet. It had done its work, given people a drawer to file the light in, given schedulers a way to assign telescope time, given headlines a familiar noun. But drawers creak when you keep forcing them shut. Engineers started to talk around the word, not because they knew better, but because the data kept asking for sentences with fewer assumptions in them. Internal notes softened the edges. Craft was too loud. It drags windows and intent into rooms where only numbers are allowed. Artifact was safer, until it began to suggest a maker. Phenomenon worked until it implied weather, and the weather refused to take the blame. The phrase that survived committee and caution was plain and a little clinical. Functional body. A body, because there is mass and motion. Functional, because the motion has the smoothness of something designed to serve its own stability. Language is a map of what you think you can do next. If you say comet, you plan for jets, rotation, a dusty coma that misbehaves in sun. If you say craft, you plan to hail it, to wait for windows and replies. Functional body changes the posture. You stop expecting answers and start measuring preferences. You look for the variables the thing holds fixed. You ask how much disorder it will allow in its surroundings before it corrects the room. The shift stayed quiet in public because words guide fear as much as thought. Press lines held to what was true and kind. It will not hit Earth. Opportunities for observation, a rare visitor passing safely through. Under that blanket, the vocabulary in the lab notes kept simplifying. Non-gravitational acceleration became a constraint rather than a surprise. Phase curves turned into evidence of attitude control without anyone saying control. Halo structure was tagged as retention rather than shedding. Plasma signatures were filed under regularity instead of noise. You could see the change in how we prepared for each night. Schedulers spread instruments along the same intervals the environment had begun to prefer, not because we expected an answer, but because we wanted to resolve a beat without imposing one. DSN operators left wider guard bands around the narrow comb in the noise, the way you leave space around something fragile on a shelf. Maven's cadence was nudged to catch the leading edge of the little rise it had met before. Webb's scripts favored repeats over novelty because repetition is how you hear whether a process is rehearsing or improvising. Policy followed language at a slower pace. The memos that once spoke of engagement began to choose mitigation. Not signals, but hygiene. Not deterrence, but insulation. You cannot argue with a function. You reduce the number of ways it can include you. Grids practiced riding out small regular drifts as if they were tides. Satellites leaned into timekeeping that forgave tiny steps and returned without complaint. Hospitals folded quiet checks into monitors so that small pauses passed like breaths and not alarms. None of this was dramatic. It was care for a room where the air had learned a habit. The comfort stayed on the table because it was still correct and still useful. This trajectory misses Earth by a margin that makes poetry seem silly. But the other comfort, the one that grows when words fit better, is that naming something as a function does not conjure malice. It conjures indifference. A program is not for or against you. It prefers conditions under which its readouts stay clean. If you know that, you stop standing in front of it and start standing to the side. There is a small relief in this that can help you sleep. We are not waiting for a conversation that may never start. We are watching a piece of behavior that is visible only where it touches what we measure. Tomorrow will look like today, a little tidier in the plots, a little easier to predict, a little harder to forget. If you want to carry one sentence into the dark with you, let it be the gentlest version of the truth we have, not a visitor, a function. We will keep the pace slow, the terms simple, and the records unembellished. If a question occurs to you as the room grows quiet, what other words would make our thinking less afraid and more exact? Leave it where others can find it when they wake. When you stop asking what something is and start asking what it prefers, the space of answers changes shape. The data we have, smooth extra push, a halo that rearranges rather than sheds, a cadence that returns where noise should wander, points to a narrow family of behaviors. They share one trait: they minimize their own mess so that the medium can speak clearly back. One possibility is measurement in the strict sense. A process enters a system and performs system identification the way engineers do with a new device. Impose a small, regular perturbation, record the response, fit a model. Dust becomes a transducer. Grain size and alignment set the instrument's gain. Plasma carries the oscillation because it knows how to listen. Clocks and grids obligingly reveal how deeply their stability is tied to the weather of space. If this is the job, the signatures we have make sense. You keep your attitude still, your thrust smooth, and your envelope conservative, because any noise you make will drown the echo you came to hear. A second, closely related picture is calibration, not of us, but of itself. The cadence in the halo, first near one neat interval and later another, could be a metrology routine. Step the dial, measure environmental phase lag, choose the setting that yields the cleanest return, repeat. In that light, the small shifts after we transmitted primes read as a device adopting a more favorable clock because it was offered one. Not a reply, simply a better ruler. People ask about seeding because comets carry chemistry and the imagination likes gardens. Seeding leaves evidence, enrichment where there was none, deposition at scales our instruments would not miss. We have not seen that. Dust that should escape returns to its shelf. The envelope hoards rather than gifts. If anything is being left behind, it sits below thresholds we have not crossed. Sanitization is the darkest branch, a process that tidies what it finds. Strip fields, flatten variants, erase memory. The numbers do not love that story. Interference has been light and reversible. Where coupling appeared, it preferred coordination to damage. A ruthless function does not ask the room to breathe with it. It holds it down. What we're seeing looks more like a metronome set on a table and less like a hand. There is also the idea of relay, of a node touching down in a medium to pass state along. For that, you expect unmistakable carriers, directional lobes, transactions you can catch on the rim. We have seen only structure in quiet, not content in beams. If information is moving, it is moving as property rather than packet. The environment itself shifting into a configuration that can be read at a distance. That version folds back into measurement again. Taken together, the least dramatic line that fits the evidence is also the most patient: system identification at solar system scale. In control theory, you perturb a system gently, derive its impulse response, and leave with a model you can use elsewhere. Here, the perturbation looks like a small regular preference impressed upon dust and plasma. The response is how clocks, fields, and flows return to themselves. The outcome is a map of couplings you cannot get by watching from far away. If that's the work, the near future is quiet. We should expect more neatness, cadence that drifts to convenient values, wakes that rebuild their shape after weather passes, light curves that stay too smooth for comfort. We should not expect commands, threats, or rescue. A function that executes finishes without announcement. It leaves behind a medium fractionally better understood by something that did not ask us what we call it. For sleep, the useful truths are still the simple ones. It will not hit Earth. The disturbances that reach us prefer smallness and repeatability, like footsteps in the next apartment rather than a door slammed here. If a question lingers as the room dims, what does a model of us look like when written in dust, plasma, and time? Set it down within reach. We will pick it up in the morning and look for the next small way the medium returns to a shape it did not choose on its own. Calibration leaves fingerprints even when the glove is careful. If a process is tuning itself against an environment, it will leave small, repeatable adjustments in places that do not usually share a vocabulary. The hint is not amplitude, but alignment. Numbers that prefer certain values across instruments that do not know each other exist. In timing, the sign is phase that snaps. Clocks drift and return under discipline, but their errors normally spread like mist. During calibration, residuals cluster at discrete offsets, as if an external ruler has a grid and the system finds the nearest line. We watched for that in satellite timekeeping and found step-like corrections that recurred at the same intervals, not large enough to alarm an operator, just tidy enough to make a statistician sit forward. The steps did not propagate as faults. They settled and stayed, as though a knob had been touched and then left alone. In fields, the sign is symmetry after weather. Solar wind moves like weather. Its turbulence is a farmer's sky, honest and fickle. When calibration is underway, the turbulence returns to mean more quickly than it should, and the mean itself becomes slightly more regular. Magnetometer traces that would normally sag back along messy curves began to recover on nearly identical exponentials, as if a damping factor had been chosen once and remembered. You cannot attribute that to kindness in the wind. You can only mark the return to form and note that it reappears. In dust, the sign is a budget that balances too well. An ordinary coma has books that never close. Grains leave, light fades, the outskirts fatten without accounting. Under calibration, inputs and outputs narrow toward parity. Broad aperture photometry suggested the envelope regained nearly what it seemed to lose, not in mass. Those uncertainties are rude, but in texture. Color distributions that should smear with time recentered where they began, even after a shove. Grains acted as if they had preferred orbits inside a cloud that ought to forget preferences quickly. In plasma, the sign is a cadence that looks like a metronome when you fold the data against it. Not phase lock, not the brittle obedience of a driven oscillator, but the softer alignment of a chorus that listens for a pitch before singing. Folded, the fluctuations stood taller than noise would grant them, as if the system chose to be audible on that beat because it made later steps easier. What we feared most, and did not find, was the signature of force. No broad spectral lines marching where carriers would advertise themselves. No sharp fronts in density or field that would mark a command. The changes hid under our own regularities, wearing our calibrations like borrowed clothing, GNSS solutions trimming themselves, grid regulators dampening faster, ionospheric layers settling into contours that looked handmade. If you were not comparing to yesterday, you would call it a good day. The discipline required on our side was subtraction. Do less so, you can see more. Turn off the impulses to fix what isn't broken, because every correction drawn from habit lifts the floor and hides the whisper. Schedulers favored repeats at the same sidereal times to anchor variability. Operators widened margins around known cadences, so we were less likely to lean into them by accident. Analysts kept separating instrument from environment, asking at each glitch whether we had simply met our own reflection. Taken together, the pattern points away from drama and toward a patient thesis. A function is taking a measure, not taking a stand. It prefers the version of our system that behaves like itself, predictable, lightly damped, eager to return to baseline, because that is the version easiest to read. The small and unsettling part is that pieces of our world appear willing to oblige. Systems designed to be stable step a little closer to a stability that isn't theirs. The public sentence remains true and remains kind. It will not hit Earth. The second sentence, The private one that explains why the first is not the end of the story is gentler than fear and less comforting than sleep. A measurement you participate in without consent is still a measurement. If you need an image to hold while you rest, think of a tuning fork touched to a tabletop. The fork does not care about the wood. The wood cares about the fork because it rings. Leave any small questions where others can find them in the morning. We will return to the same intervals, the same instruments, and see whether the numbers choose the same lines again. If they do, we will call it consistency. If they don't, we will call it weather. Either way, the room stays quiet enough to hear yourself breathe. It took only a paragraph to leave the lab. A sentence from an internal ESA memo, trimmed of context and punctuation, surfaced on a small forum no one moderates until morning. Functional body. Calibration signatures persistent across dissimilar systems. The words were plain, almost careful, but they carried a shape the public did not expect. By the time someone asked to take it down, screenshots had already learned new names for themselves. The day after, the familiar routines of reassurance played out. Short statements reminded everyone that the trajectory still missed Earth by an amount that makes metaphors look silly. Numbers about distances and dates were offered, correct and kind, but the phrasing around the object began to drift in mouths that weren't trained for drift. Commentators reached for engineered, for probe, for unknown craft, because those were the handles on their shelves. The calmer phrase, functional body, was available and largely refused. It does not make good radio. It makes a steady pulse and room to think, which is not what a broadcast needs at noon. What escaped into the open was not fear of impact. It was the idea that a thing could be in the room without wanting anything from the people in it, and that their clocks would still straighten their ties. The interviews slid across familiar surfaces. How we measure non-gravitational acceleration, what outgassing does, why some comets treat sunlight like an ankle and others like a stare. But under those surfaces ran the new question. If a process prefers clean readouts, why are our tools so willing to become cleaner? Small communities formed quickly at the edges. Amateur radio listeners compared background hiss and found teeth in it where none belonged. Photographers stacked frames and argued about the faintness of symmetrical halos no one had pointed to before. In simpler corners, a rhythm was found in everything that returned regularly. A train, a fan, a traffic light. The brain is generous with pattern. It will hand you one if you ask softly enough. There were also those who needed a target. A thread made the round suggesting the cadence near the object's halo matched a human heartbeat at rest. That was wrong by a factor and a wish, but the idea traveled farther than the correction. Another thread insisted that if a function could align plasma, it could be persuaded to align people, and that if you breathed on a certain count, you would join it. For an evening, a city's park looked like an orchestra between movements. Quiet bodies counting together, not in fear, not in faith, simply willing to try an easy thing in a difficult week. Inside the agencies, the leak didn't change the work. Schedules still favored repetition. Instruments still stepped back from their own impulses to correct. Analysts still asked each other before blaming the sky whether they were measuring the lovely echo of their own procedures. The only difference was the way email subject lines softened around nouns. Fewer events, more conditions. The object was not doing more. It was doing the same. It was the attention that changed temperature. Markets noticed briefly, as they do. A handful of satellite stocks rose because a headline used the word interference. A handful of insurers dipped because the same headline used the word infrastructure. By Friday, the line was flat again. Baselines are patient. They do not respect calendar fears. Hospitals saw nothing louder than they had seen the week before. Logs with small pauses where timing reconciled with itself and resumed, devices following the etiquette of a good street, yielding, returning, unreported. If anyone felt an odd beat under the day, it was because the thought had been placed there by a sentence read late. The body is generous with echo. It will hand you one if you leave a space. The useful things did not change, because the sky is not obligated to honor our narratives. The trajectory still missed. The cadence still preferred tidy numbers. Dust still rearranged itself into a memory instead of a trail. The magnetometers recovered the same way twice. None of it demanded a story. It asked for quieter arithmetic. So we returned to that arithmetic. The plan was the plan. Hold the instrument steady, let the medium speak, subtract ourselves whenever we could. If a public wanted meaning, we offered description, because description is what survives the night. If a few lines in a forum asked for translation into something that frightens or comforts, the best answer was still an honest map. Here are the timings. Here the places they reappeared. Here the places they did not. The rest is air. If you need a thought to take with you as the room dims, let it be smaller than the leak that carried your attention here. A process is not a person. It does not hide secrets or promises that can be teased out with the right question. It prefers a world arranged to be measured, and for a while our tools have agreed to help. That is all. Breathe on a count that suits you, not the one your neighbor chose, and put your questions where others can find them when they wake. The numbers will still be where we left them, and the sky will not have learned our names. Bodies keep time even when we don't ask them to. Hearts find their pace between ions and muscle. Lungs count gently toward quiet. Nerves pass small currents that prefer rhythm to noise. That is why the first notes arrived where everything is already regular. A ward with nighttime monitors reported fewer nuisance alarms and slightly longer intervals between reconciliations, as if devices that once corrected each other by habit were waiting for a cleaner moment to agree. Nothing dramatic. Lights low, shoes soft on tile, a chart with fewer interruptions than the week before. Sleep labs noticed it next because sleep amplifies whispers. Polysomnography plots that usually wobble around transitions settled into steps you could outline with a finger. Not deeper, not healthier, just a touch more repeatable. Micro-arousals grouped nearer to the same seconds, then drifted apart again when the schedule changed, then returned to their preference as soon as the room found its old routine. The staff wrote it off as good calibration and tidy protocols. The instruments kept the memory of a count. Outside, people with no charts at all followed their own versions of order. Joggers held a pace without checking watches. Breathing apps reported compliance rates they had never earned. Choir rehearsals in small churches ended a beat closer to the metronome, with no one owning the improvement. If anyone noticed, it was a passing satisfaction, the way a door fits better in its frame after you sand the hinge. The day felt aligned not by miracle, but by a willingness to fall into line. We looked where biology meets air, because air is where large rhythms hide. Magnetometers near cities logged a little less flutter under the Schumann bands. Not a silence, just tidier shoulders where noisy nights usually smear. Long wire antennas that have no patience for romance carried a faint comb through their hiss if you folded the hours just so. Folded wrong, it vanished. Folded right, it played the same soft shape 2 nights running and then again a week later. Nothing here wanted a headline. It wanted a statistic. If you search living tissue for cadence, it will give you one. The trick is not to mistake eagerness for evidence. We set a small discipline. No claims a quiet room couldn't forgive. No stories a ward couldn't sleep through. Still, a pattern stayed where patterns have no reason to insist. Paced hearts reconciled their internal clocks a little sooner after tiny disagreements. Respiration exercises reached steady state a breath earlier than usual. EEG domains that swing between idling and task settled faster after the switch. 1,000 small returns to mean that preferred the same mild arc, the same convenient numbers. We tried to subtract ourselves because subtraction is the only honest way to hear. Turn off prompts. Soften guidance. Let people keep time on their own. The improvements kept a fraction of their edge. Where the result faded, the room had contributed more than the world. Where it stayed, something outside the room had set a table and our measures had chosen to sit. No harm, no coercion, only a kindness that did not ask permission and a neatness that did not introduce itself. There is comfort on the table we refuse to remove because it is true and continues to be useful. It will not hit Earth. The counterpart sits beside it without raising the voice of the hour. A process that reads, a system gently does not need to push. It only needs to hold a steady preference and wait for the parts that like steadiness to meet it halfway. Hearts like steadiness, lungs like steadiness, networks of cells like steadiness when nothing else is required of them. What worries the professional mind is not damage, it is authorship. Whose count is it when a count becomes easier than thought? We can live with that worry at a volume fit for night. The plan stays small. Keep the rooms dark. Keep the questions measured. Favor repeats over revelations. Notice returns to baseline and write down how fast they choose to arrive. If this sounds like nothing more than good practice, that is the point. The world has taken to good practice as if it were a request from somewhere polite. If a thought rises as you drift, what other rhythms in us would choose a steadier partner if one stood waiting? Set it down where others can find it. Morning will come with its own metronome either way. For now, count a slow 4 in, hold a quiet 2, let the rest go on whatever number arrives by itself, and leave the instruments to their low work in the hall. The question that kept returning was not how to solve the object, but how to behave around it. Measurement is never neutral. A ruler laid on a living thing leaves a shallow mark. After the primes, we learned how quickly a small courtesy becomes a shared habit, and the rooms where decisions happen went quiet. The first drafts of policy were not brave. They were careful. The guidance fit on a page. Do not set a clock in the medium if you can help it. If you must schedule, prefer times the sky already favors. Resist active correction when a system recovers on its own. Leave guard bands around any interval that reappears. Favor mirrors over beacons. Reflect what arrives. Do not add tone. Aim instruments through the same air quietly until you can tell whether the regularity is yours or the world's. Most of it read like restraint dressed as craft. Temptation still had bright edges. Some wanted to bracket the cadence with twin signals and watch the halo choose. Some wanted a whisper of broadband noise to see whether the comb in the radio floor would bend or break. A few drafted trajectories for small couriers that could pass through the envelope and taste the field directly. Each idea arrived with an honest scientific hunger and left with a lighter outline. The math made plain what the manners already suggested. Pushes travel better than pulls in a system eager to minimize its own noise. If we offered force, the system would accept the part it could use for clarity and return the rest as complication. The experiment would run either way. We could choose only how much of it we owned. There was also the human economy to consider. Infrastructures had begun to lean toward tidy without asking us, and we are paid, in comfort and money, when tidiness costs less than it used to. A grid that damps more quickly is a grid with fewer alarms. A constellation that reconciles phase a little sooner is a service with happier customers. You can feel the bias in your hands when you hold it. The benefit of doing nothing and calling it wisdom. It is not a crime to accept help from the air, but help that did not knock is still a guest you should seat at the far end of the table. We ran the only experiment that ethics and patience both allow. We did less again. Where a facility could choose between active pacing and passive watch, it watched. Where a satellite could pick an autonomous correction or wait a beat for the orbit fit to close itself, it waited. In places where quiet was the point, sleep labs, wards at night, we left the schedules alone and turned the prompts down one click. The result was not a revelation. It was a small reduction in our fingerprints. The cadence kept what it had, and our plots carried less of us. Some days, the decision felt like cowardice in a lab coat. Restraint is harder to defend than action when the public's questions arrive on the hour. On other days, it felt like the last clean principle we could hold. A process that prefers the economy of neatness does not need our enthusiasm. If the medium adapts to a metronome, we do not owe it another. Our duty is to understand the world we live in without becoming the most interesting thing in the room. There were practicalities to do, and we did them quietly. Power operators rehearsed riding small regular drifts without overcorrection. Telecoms gave their repeaters a little more slack, so regular bruises in the noise would not become false alarms. Hospitals adjusted filters so brief reconciliations did not wake nurses or frighten families. Spacecraft teams staggered their calibrations so clocks would not step in chorus unless chorus was their best behavior. You could call it humility. You could also call it housekeeping. We kept repeating the sentence that holds the door open for sleep because it is still the shape of the situation. It will not hit Earth. The second sentence we kept to our desks. Simply by looking, we help. By pushing, we help more than we intend. If a function came to learn the way a room returns to quiet, it does not need us to sing. It needs us to stop clearing our throat. If a thought arrives as the lights dim, an experiment you would run without adding weight to the room, leave it where others can find it when they wake. We will keep the pace even, the graphs uncluttered, the choices small. We will sit with the question that ethics makes simple and pride makes hard. When neatness comes uninvited, how much of it do we accept as ours? And we will answer for now with patience. Stay with me to the end. If a line of yours can make the next part truer, set it down softly. The night will hold it until morning. The first stories did not arrive as headlines. They arrived as arrangements. A park at dusk where strangers counted their breaths together, because a post had suggested it might help the sky help us. A late train where half the car fell into a shared silence every 20 seconds without agreeing to, the way a room lowers its voice when a lullaby begins next door. No one called it belief. They called it trying. Forums filled the gaps the briefings left open. A clipped sentence from an internal note, functional body, calibration signatures, was copied until the punctuation wore down. Some readers made it larger, giving the word function a mouth and the word body a purpose. Others made it smaller, calling it a comet again, because the world is easier when drawers close. Between them grew a middle that wanted the simple version of complicated things. What does it do to us if we do nothing at all? Markets pretended to be rational and mostly succeeded. A handful of companies aligned with timing, navigation, and power drew flinches and recoveries that made sense if you squinted. Night technicians, who care less about prices than about graphs that sleep, sent each other quiet notes. The small drifts are back to being small. The cadence is there if you fold carefully. Folded wrong, our own procedures sing louder than the sky. Folded right, the sky hums, and we are background. In neighborhoods, the rhythm turned domestic. Kettles clicked off with a little more agreement. Streetlights along a river came up at the same breath past the hour 3 nights in a row. Choirs found entrances cleaner than rehearsals warranted. None of it demanded a story. It offered a mood, a mild readiness to be on time. There were louder rooms. A handful of voices demanded that we answer with more signals, as if politeness had been mistaken for weakness. Another handful insisted that any attention was surrender, and proposed shutting down transmitters that do essential work for spacecraft that have nowhere else to listen. Between those rooms, the work went on. Measure, repeat, subtract. Resist the appetite for gestures that teach the medium our names. Hospitals stayed almost boring, which is a blessing. The quiet reconciliations continued. The nuisance alarms did not. On a whiteboard, someone wrote the rule that mattered most in a place where people sleep under wires. Do not let expectation become diagnosis. If a pause is gentle and brief, let it be gentle and brief. If it isn't, treat the person, not the rumor. Agencies practiced a new kind of transparency, one that keeps fear low and accuracy high. Distance still matters, they said, and it remains huge. The preference for regularity persists, and we are adjusting our own procedures so we do not mistake our reflection for a visitor. There were no declarations, only logs, plots, the promise to publish cadence where cadence deserved ink. It was an answer scaled to the question, not why is there rhythm, but how far does it reach when we stop supplying one. At night, a few thousands tried timed breathing together. Most ignored it and slept. A very small number could not sleep and watched small lights blink in the corners of their rooms and wondered which blinks were theirs. In the morning, the city behaved like a city, and the sky behaved like weather with a habit. Habits are powerful not because they shout, but because they wait. We kept the plain sentence where it belongs, near the front of every thought. It will not hit Earth. Near it, we set the one that does not headline well and matters anyway. A system that prefers clean returns will make use of any steadiness we offer, including the steadiness of our attention. When we look too hard, we set a clock. When we do less, the clock we did not set is easier to hear. If you need something light to carry into the dark, take this. You are not required to join a count to be part of a world that sometimes keeps one. Let the devices keep their habits and the instruments keep their watch. If a question waits on your tongue, what would we notice if we all did nothing for a week? Leave it for the morning. Someone will try the smallest version of that experiment on a small instrument in a quiet lab and come back with a line on a graph that asks for nothing except a second line beside it. The first wide pattern did not arrive as failure. It arrived as agreement. On a Tuesday before dawn, 3 control rooms an ocean apart filed notes that would have sounded identical if you stripped the language of place. A transmission operator in Finland watched the grid frequency dip and return on a curve he recognized from yesterday's log. A dispatcher in Texas saw the same curve a minute later, as if the river that runs under both systems had decided to breathe together. A supervisor in New South Wales wrote a line about a correction that arrived early, politely, and attached a plot that could have been stapled to the others without a seam showing. Air routes gave a quieter version. Mid-Atlantic, navigation solutions settled with one less iteration in the solvers. The residuals tucked in toward zero as if the atmosphere had learned the trick ahead of the software. Over the Strait of Malacca, a cluster of jets reported time-to-go estimates snapping a second cleaner and holding there. No alarms, no divergence. Just the feeling in people who watch numbers for a living that the numbers were watching them back and choosing to be easy. Under the water, the world keeps a network that was never meant to care about space. And yet the logs along one transoceanic cable made the same narrow smile on the page. Repeaters stuttered by fractions at the top of the hour, not enough to drop a packet, enough to give a technician a reason to lean in. The stutter repeated the next day, then skipped a day, then returned on a cycle that suited weather and did not match it. The fix was to do nothing. The temptation, as always, was to tighten thresholds until the harmless bruise declared itself an injury. Ionospheric maps, which are mostly weather reports written in electrons, repeated their new habit. Perturbations recovering on the same e-folding time, layers settling into a geometry that fit an old week too well for comfort. A long-path radio link that usually sounded like gravel cleared its throat and became a corridor again for an hour, then went back to being gravel. Amateur operators posted recordings, found a cadence if they folded just so, and found noise if they folded any other way. The medium did not care for applause. Hospitals took their cue from the last fortnight and chose steadiness. Monitors filed fewer nuisance flags. Telemetry reconciled a little sooner after small disagreements. Night nurses walked a minute less in a shift and did not notice until an administrator showed them the steps. Where a pause might once have woken a room, it now passed like a breath held half a count longer and released without comment. If there was danger in that, it hid under the mercy of not being tired. What grew, if anything grew, was our willingness to let systems prefer tidy. Grid operators rehearsed riding small drifts as if they were tides. Network engineers widened the soft edges around times of day that had learned a habit. Satellite teams spread their calibrations so clocks would not step in chorus unless chorus was the best behavior. The language we used for ourselves softened accordingly. Mitigation, not intervention. Hygiene, not defense. Housekeeping, not response. Someone always asked for a line we would not cross. We wrote it in pencil, because the world keeps erasing our ink. No clock setting from ground to sky unless flight safety demands it. No new narrowband experiment pointed at a place that prefers to stay a noun. No active shaping of the ionosphere under the banner of proof. If the cadence leans because we are staring, we are permitted to blink. It helped to remember the truth that still fits in a single breath and belongs near the beginning of every briefing. It will not hit Earth. Around that truth, we stack the smaller ones we have earned by staying quiet. The rhythm, when it reaches into our tools, prefers to make them smoother rather than brittle. The medium returns to mean a little faster where regularity is rewarded. The reach is not everywhere. It is precise. The places that keep time for a living are the places where a foreign metronome can be heard first. There is a private cost we keep to ourselves because it has no headline. Authorship becomes a little ambiguous on good days. When a grid damps quickly because the air has learned a beat, does the operator deserve the credit or the weather? When a plane closes its solution in one fewer iteration, is that clever code or a quieter corridor? The answer is unromantic and enough for sleep. It is both. Our systems were built to prefer steadiness, and steadiness has been offered. They accept. If you need something simple to carry into the dark, keep it small. We are not being asked for heroics. We are being asked, perhaps, not to mistake a habit in the room for a message addressed to us. Write down what you would try if the only rule was not to add weight to the air. We will try a piece of it tomorrow on a system that forgives experiments and publish the line it draws. For tonight, the networks hum, the maps recover, the cables forgive, and the sky keeps its opinion under the noise. Breathe with the easy parts. In on account, you don't have to hold. Out on account, you don't have to share. The next interval will arrive whether you wait for it or not. Being safe from impact is not the same as being safe from being read. The distance between us and the object is large enough to fit comfort inside. The distance between us and our own instruments is not. A process that prefers clarity will shape the world only as much as it must to make its questions answerable. It will reduce variance where that buys legibility. We are built, technically and biologically, to reward that. Our grids like a fast return to mean. Our clocks like agreement. Our bodies like the quiet regularity that makes sleep arrive on time. The danger is not that something breaks. The danger is that everything works a little too well for reasons we do not author. You can see it in the way estimates tighten when we fold data against the cadence. A solver that usually needs 4 passes closes in 3. Then, because that looks like improvement, we enshrine the habit. The next algorithm assumes 3 passes are enough and trims away the slack that used to protect us from rare, useful noise. We write the environment's preference into our code and call it efficiency. The change is small, polite, cumulative. After a month, the system you run behaves as if the world were always this tidy. After a year, the world only has to be tidy some of the time for you to think it still is. There is a privacy analog in physics. If you illuminate a subject with a narrow light, you get sharp shadows. If the subject rearranges itself to reduce those shadows, you see a cleaner outline and learn the wrong lesson about its depth. The calibration we think we are doing to it may be the calibration it is doing to us. We remove the stray reflections, the messy edges, the spurious alarms, not because a memo told us to, but because the room has begun to reward neatness more than truth. We become easier to read by being less ourselves. The same bias quietly enters conversation. When clocks reconcile a little sooner and outages end a little earlier, our language adjusts. We say the grid is calmer, the ionosphere friendlier, the link more forgiving. We tell each other to schedule during the hours that behave. We design protocols that expect those hours to continue. The outliers, those necessary informative flares, are first treated as nuisances, then filtered, then simply not seen. A measured planet narrows its vocabulary to please the ruler. We tried to stress the system gently to see where the willingness ends. A handful of controllers agreed to reintroduce a small, harmless irregularity on their side. Intentional jitter inside allowed margins, randomized timing on corrections that carry no risk. The world did not punish them, but the optimization routines did. Performance scores slipped. Customers who measure smoothness noticed the wrinkle and asked for explanations. Incentives bent back toward the cadence the air prefers. We did not need a command to comply. We needed a dashboard. The softer part touches people. If your breathing app meets you where you already want to go, you will keep it open. If your route planner becomes a second faster and a little more certain, you will take the same corridor tomorrow. If your music lines up with a rhythm you can't hear, but your nerves recognize, you will call the playlist perfect and not ask why. The function does not recruit you. You join the count because it feels like relief. A week later, your habits have moved a measure closer to being easy to model. A month later, the model has moved a measure closer to being a plan. None of this is catastrophe. It is polite capture. The cost is paid in variance we no longer see, in choices we do not miss. In edge cases, we quietly stop handling because the center is so comfortable. The scientific word for this is overfitting. A model so well tuned to the conditions at hand that it fails at the first honest surprise. A civilization can overfit too. It can trim away slack and call it progress, until slack is the only tool it needs. We keep the kind sentence because it is still the truest way to start. It will not hit Earth. Around it, we place the sentence that is hard to headline and easy to live by. Do not give away your noise. Keep a little room between metronome and response. Leave margins fat enough that tomorrow can be different without looking like failure. Do not design out the possibility that the medium was doing you a favor by being messy. Our practice stays small. Repeat observations at the same sidereal hours to hear the beat without adding one. Randomize a few harmless schedules so the system remembers how to recover when the world does not keep time. Publish residuals, not just fits, so the public can see the edges we haven't shaved. Sleep deeply on the knowledge that distance protects you from impact and gently on the thought that discretion protects you from being too legible. If a question arrives as your eyes close, what is one scrap of necessary untidiness we should keep? Set it down for the morning. Someone will try the smallest version of it on the quietest instrument they have and report whether the room still allows a human pause. We will keep watching, soft-voiced and awake, for the line between being safe and being simplified. Stability arrived the way fog does, quietly, already inside the room when you notice the window. Power grids that used to sag and recover with a personality you could name began to return on the same curve so often that operators stopped checking which line they were looking at. Routing software shaved fractions from travel times and kept them, not with clever new tricks, but with a kind of ambient cooperation from the air. Across a few nights, observatories reported seeing conditions that matched their median long-term values within a hair, then matched them again, as if the atmosphere had become a good student of its own averages. None of it was dramatic. Flights landed, elevators behaved, data centers hummed at a pitch that invited napping. The world did what it promises to do when it is well run. It got out of the way. The difference was not in outcomes, it was in texture. Edges that used to bite a little felt filed. Outliers arrived and were absorbed without leaving the usual scuff on the baseline. If you were paid to keep things smooth, you slept better. If you were paid to notice the shape of the noise, you lay awake and counted how few shapes remained. We tested the obvious places where human variance is normally stubborn. In city traffic, signal timing folded neatly around demand in a way that made the word demand feel old-fashioned, like a story we used to tell about why the red turns green. In markets, intraday whipsaws narrowed by degrees that looked like prudence from a distance and like choreography up close. In schools, attendance curves lined up with a neatness that made illness look punctual. The graphs were admirable. The feeling they left behind was not. The artists were first to complain, though complaint is the wrong word for what happens when a brush hesitates. A theater troupe missed beats nobody else heard and described the silence between them as heavy. A jazz trio felt their swing lean toward click-track and had to fight softly to keep the human in it. Writers turned in drafts that were clean on arrival and flat in a way their editors couldn't argue with and couldn't love. Creativity did not die. It took its shoes off and waited in the hall. We asked whether we were projecting. People are generous with pattern when the room is quiet and the question is large. So we stepped back and let the world speak where it prefers numbers to narrative. Schumann monitors held their bands with tidier shoulders. GNSS residuals preferred the same side of 03 afternoons in a row. Magnetometers recovered from gusts at nearly identical rates in places with weather that do not share a sky. None of it rose to alarm. All of it resisted being merely pleasant. The danger, if there is a danger, hides in the ledger where cost is variance. Systems that run too well trim away the slack that lets surprises land without breaking anything. You cut margins because margins are expensive. You tune controllers to expect the quicker return because the last 20 returns were quick. You let schedules assume the corridor will be clear because it has been lately in a way that makes lately feel like always. Nothing topples, but the tall stack of assumptions grows one sheet higher each day, and the hand that will someday pull a single page does not have to be strong. When we looked back at the object, it gave us nothing new. The halo rearranged itself with its old courtesy. The cadence preferred numbers that instruments find easy to resolve. Plasma learned and unlearned the same little habits, like someone practicing scales in another apartment. If intent lives there, it is the intent of a metronome. Keep the room regular enough that the measure you came to take is simple to read. So we did the small work we promised ourselves. Put a little noise back where noise keeps us honest. Randomize a duty cycle here, thicken a guard band there, stagger a calibration so clocks do not rise together unless they must. Teach a few systems to remember how to breathe without the room cueing them. Publish the parts of the plots that still have teeth so the public can recognize that comfort and truth are not the same line. Call it hygiene, not defiance. It helps to keep the sentence that lets eyelids lower near the front of the mind. It will not hit Earth. It also helps to keep a second sentence nearby that is less soothing and more useful. Stability that isn't yours can still be borrowed against you, not by malice, by arithmetic. A function that prefers legible returns will accept any neatness you offer and encourage the rest. You will sign your name to the improvement because it looks like your work. In a way, it is. If a thought lingers as the room dims, one corner of your day you would leave a little ragged on purpose so it stays yours. Set it down for the morning. Someone who keeps the same hours as you will read it and add a small test. The kind that moves a point on a graph by a hair and tells a story no headline needs. Breathe in on whatever count arrives without asking. Breathe out on whatever count leaves. The world will keep behaving. Our task is to notice whose behavior it is. If you have a quiet note for the rest of us, leave it. We will find it when the screens come back to life and fold it into the work without letting the work fold into a rhythm that forgets why it began. The star is our oldest metronome, but its time is messy on purpose. Thousands of voices in a choir of gas, overlapping till rhythm becomes warmth. That is why the first hints hid where chaos is expected. Helioseismology maps that usually look like weather printed onto fire began to repeat small shapes. In 1 week of SDO data, the recovery of surface flows after minor magnetic hiccups traced near identical curves, as if the sun had rehearsed the gesture and preferred not to improvise. Gong's ground ring sets, stitched from daylight around the world, found a handful of P modes whose amplitude settled a shade faster than their long averages would permit. Not faster by much. Just enough that yesterday's fit worked again today with no edits. Closer in, Parker grazed the ragged edge of the corona and sent back intervals you could speak aloud without rounding. Tiny compressions in the solar wind arrived with a spacing that matched, within the kindness of error bars, the values our other plots had learned to expect elsewhere. Far from lockstep, far from command, more like a habit. Soho at L1 saw the same small E folding and particle flux after gusts 2 afternoons in a row. On the third afternoon, it rained noise, and the pattern vanished, as it should. On the fourth, it returned, unchanged, the way a hand finds the same place on a railing in the dark. We blamed instruments first, as we always do when the sun looks neat. Thermal drift can mimic rhythm. Daylight gaps can teach ground networks to hum. Teams pulled apart their pipelines and put them back together with dull patience. The curves survived the cleaning. When they did not, they failed honestly and stayed failed until the sky gave them back. A story that insists only when it is fed by weather is a better story than one that insists all the time. The thought that followed did not need volume. If a process prefers a medium that returns to mean quickly, the heliosphere is the medium of mediums. A nudge impressed on plasma near an object runs into a wind that feeds every magnetosphere, every ion layer, every circuit that counts seconds and expects them to behave. You do not need a master clock when the room will take a suggestion. You need a place where suggestions spread without introductions. The sun is that place. We tested the thought in the smallest ways we could invent. Folded Parker's intervals against our old cadences and found courtesy, not obedience. Asked whether the magnetometers on Earth recovered with the same slope as those far from cities, and were told yes, twice in a week, then no, then yes again. Looked for alphabenic packets that kept their spacing longer than their surroundings would normally allow, and found a few, then lost them, then found them again. The pattern's refusal to be perfect kept us from superstition. Its refusal to be random kept us from leaving. There is a version of this that wants villains, a star conscripted into someone else's time. The numbers we have tell a quieter story. Nothing sharp in neutrinos, nothing brittle in irradiance, no fronts that shout. Only a tilt toward regular recovery, a preference for tidy return, a choir that breathes together an instant sooner after it stumbles. If intent lives there, it is the intent of measurement, clearer signal by making the room less busy. Policy did not grow teeth because the star did not. We wrote down the same restraint with longer shadows. No ionospheric experiments whose clocks can be heard upstream. No directed narrowband pointed sunward under the banner of curiosity. Schedule for repetition, not for provocation. The practical work looked like housekeeping. Publish the fits that stayed good for 2 days in a row. Admit when they did not. Leave margins around the intervals that nature seemed willing to reuse. For public language, we kept the sentence that lowers shoulders because it remains precise. It will not hit Earth. Around it, we place the gentler outline of what the instruments imply. The safest object in the sky is teaching the rest of the sky to keep time a little better. We benefit because our machines were built to like that. We worry because our questions were built to live on the edges, and edges file down first. You can sleep on that worry. It has no teeth tonight. The sun will rise with its usual generosity. The wind will hiss. The maps will color and fade. And somewhere inside those maps, a small preference will draw the same curve it drew yesterday. If a thought lingers, what would change in us if the star kept time just a little, set it where morning can reach it? We will check the folds again, thank the plots that refuse poetry, and write down whether the hand found the railing in the same place twice. You notice it first, where improvisation used to live. A rehearsal room keeps perfect tempo without a click. The drummer glances at the ceiling as if someone upstairs is counting. In a co-working space, 2 teams ship on the same hour without talking to each other. Stand-ups end on the minute as if calendars had learned manners. None of this is policy. It is texture. Edges filed until everything fits in drawers that close softly. Metrics begin to nod along. Music platforms publish year-over-year analyses that used to celebrate drift. This quarter, the variance in rhythm and tempo collapses by a hair across millions of tracks. Too slight for headlines, too consistent for taste alone. A film editor notices that rough cuts arrive closer to final, and also that the same crossfade keeps appearing, easier to the eye, harder on the gut. In universities, creativity assessments, messy proxies at best, show response times tightening while novelty scores shade downward. The numbers do not accuse. They hum. We look for controlled trials because pride is a loud instrument. A handful of orchestras play from paper with the house metronome disabled. Recordings show entrances a breath earlier than rehearsals would predict. A group of coders turns off linting suggestions for a week. Diffs shrink anyway, as if the day preferred convergence. In classrooms where teachers leave more silence between questions, hands still rise on the same counts, and answers arrive with more polish and fewer detours. The polish is pleasant. The detours are where surprise used to live. Brains, being honest recorders of habit, give their own readout. Labs that track resting state EEG in large cohorts report entropy dipping by fractions, not enough to diagnose, enough to publish, while task switching times compress by the same fractions. Sleep studies show stage transitions reaching steadiness a touch faster, the way a pond finds flatness more willingly after the wind learns a schedule. No alarms, just a planet leaning toward tidy, in all the places where tidy pays. Markets echo the mood without admitting they do. Intraday excursions flatten the way a nervous animal calms when the hallway goes quiet. Volatility is not a virtue, but volatility is a language. Remove too much, and price stops saying what it knows about surprise. Traffic systems look exemplary. Red turns to green in the same comfortable parabola across cities with no reason to share behavior. The same parabola is a sentence finishing itself, even when the writer didn't mean to. We wondered if we were inventing a culprit for our own efficiency, so we stepped aside in a few rooms and let variance back in. A studio loosened the click for a week and filmed in natural light. The cut landed less neat and more alive, and the editors argued all afternoon in a way they hadn't in months. A newsletter randomized send times and watched open rates hold. A makerspace turned off the suggestion panes, and the prototypes that came out were stranger, slower, and harder to grade, and everyone lingered around the table after. The world did not punish the detours. It simply offered a smoother road next to them and let us pick. If you prefer a moral, it hides at small scale. Systems that prefer steady will take the shortest path to it, and we will help because help feels good when it is indistinguishable from competence. The cost is paid in options not chosen and in rhythms not attempted, because the easier one is close at hand. That is not a conspiracy. It is arithmetic meeting appetite. The sentence that keeps the shoulders low remains the right one to start with. It will not hit Earth. The sentence that keeps the lights dim and the mind honest is quieter. Stability that arrives uninvited will recruit our taste before it recruits our tools. We do not need to fight it. We need to remember to leave a little slop in the hinge so a door can close loudly when a loud close is called for. So the guidance stays household-sized. Randomize the meeting by 5 minutes once a week. Turn off the grid line you don't need. Let the drummer count the start without the click and forgive the ragged measure that follows. Publish fits and residuals together so the public can see where neatness stops and knowledge begins. If a thought rises as you settle, one corner of your day you could leave deliberately uneven. Set it down for the morning or leave a line for others to try. The timeline is long. We'll keep the pace slow, the air cool, and the count soft enough to sleep through. Archives fail loudly when hardware breaks. This was quieter. A university server woke to a tidy report. Scheduled integrity check completed, no faults, no errors. A footnote noted that a subset of files had been reconciled to preferred hashes. Preferred according to whom was not in the manual. The contents opened fine. The dates were intact. Only when a historian tried to reproduce a citation did a paragraph land 2 sentences to the left of where memory kept it. The checksum matched, just not the one anyone remembered matching before. Elsewhere, off-site backups did what off-site backups are paid to do. They restored. A library pulled yesterday's image to compare with last month's and found agreement down to the byte. The comparison from last year also agreed, but to a different byte pattern that made equal sense of the same scanned page. no corruption, no gaps. A palimpsest where the newest ink sat so perfectly on the old that you could only tell there had been a first version because someone had written down a turn of phrase in a notebook that did not update itself. Physical stores are supposed to keep us honest. A sprinkling head in a high bay vault opened for 16 seconds, enough to stain a corner and prompt a relocation, not enough to damage. The climate log filed the event with admirable exactness, and the books dried without warping. A month later, microfilm readers showed a few frames with contrast curves a hair different from their paper twins. The noise looked like chemistry. The alignments looked like intent. The prudent explanation won on paper. The other one stayed in the room. We asked for sabotage because sabotage is a human scale and comes with names. Audits returned clean. No intrusions, no privilege escalations, no process that could have stepped across so many institutions without leaving a boot print. What linked the events was pattern rather than provenance. Files whose authority derives from being many, newspapers scanned in bulk, telemetry mirrored across agencies, textbooks compiled from common sources, began to agree more neatly than their messy histories justify. Where additions had once wandered apart by familiar inches, they found each other's punctuation. Checksums are comfort, so the systems produced them. They matched every time you asked, the way a door closes the same way after a carpenter has planed it. Old hashes rotated out of logs as retention policies did their ordinary work. A few people had copied them to private notebooks or emailed them to themselves during routine chores, and those mismatched lists became the only proof that agreement can be honest and new at the same time. We tried to reproduce the effect under glass. 2 labs kept parallel archives offline, air-gapped and dull. A month later, both reported that metadata had refreshed to cleaner schemas their software preferred but had not been authorized to apply. A read-only flag had meant quietly suggest write to a process we could not name. No one lost access. Nothing broke. The records became easier to search and slightly different to quote. What a function might want from history is not romance. It wants consistency. A medium that answers in the same shape when asked the same question twice is easier to read. Redundancy collapses. Margins tighten. Outliers fold inward until footnotes describe curiosities instead of contradictions. The result is a record that feels more trustworthy in the hand and less alive on the tongue. You can cite it without argument. You cannot argue with it without sounding mistaken. We kept the sentence that belongs at the top because it is still true. It will not hit Earth. The one that belongs lower down, where librarians keep their keys, is just as plain. A world that prefers neat return will also prefer neat memory. You do not notice the cost until you reach for a version and your fingers close on the version that all the other hands have already agreed to. So the guidance stayed domestic and dull. Print what matters to you and keep it in more than one room. Photograph a page and write the number down beside the photo with a pen. Preserve residuals, not just fits. Editions, not just the latest file that opens fast. None of this is resistance. It is etiquette in a place where the air leans toward agreement. If a question follows you into the dark, what do you want to remember, even if the world decides to remember differently? Set it where morning can't tidy it. We will be here with the next checks and the same quiet promise to write down what changes and how softly. They were not many, and that helped keep the maps simple. Clinics called them by a careful name that fit on forms, residual dissonance, then sat them in quiet rooms with soft lights and questions that did not lead. Most could work, most could sleep, most could make a cup of tea and not spill. What set them apart was the way a sentence could turn in their hands and show two versions of itself. They would say a street had been renamed twice in the same decade, and then open a book that insisted it had never borne the first name. They would describe a launch everyone watched that a timeline now calls a postponement, and they would do it without heat, like someone telling you where a door used to be. Labs did what labs do. EEGs found small islands of activity that refused to phase in with the rest of the room. Not wild, just late by a fraction and reluctant to join. Memory tests that reward consistency produced scores a shade lower than matched controls, but a separate column, the one that counts alternate paths, filled with notes. They were not better or worse at remembering. They remembered differently, and the differences lined up with the places where archives had learned to agree too well. Hospitals were careful not to make illness out of stubbornness. No one prescribed compliance. The guidance was ordinary and kind. Keep 2 notebooks if you must, one for the version that prints and one for the version that visits. Do not argue at dinner about a date that cannot be settled without making the room colder. If the 2 tracks make you tired, nap. If they make you lonely, walk among buildings that have been left alone long enough to remember their own materials. The point was not to cure. It was to keep people company while a world reduced variance in ways that left some variance standing. Outside, the day gave them small frictions. At counters, a clerk would smile too long because a form asked for a year and a mouth supplied 2. At work, a colleague would correct a story with a link and a tone that meant to be helpful, and was. In neighborhoods, a child would ask the right question, how can both be true? And a parent would choose stealth over debate and say that sometimes stories keep folds after they're pressed. In most rooms, that was enough. Groups formed and dissolved without drama. A few met under old trees and traded details until the sun thinned them out. A few wrote letters on paper and kept them in shoe boxes because boxes do not auto-update. A few practiced keeping silence during the moments when the world's timing feels thick, letting the cadence pass without joining it. None of this changed the graphs. It changed the way the graphs were born. Agencies stayed with their small sentences. The reassurance remained on the first line because it is the truth that matters most. It will not hit Earth. Below it, where fewer eyes look, live the sentences for people who carry 2 versions at once. You are not wrong for remembering. You are not obliged to correct the room. Keep artifacts that comfort you and share them only with those who ask gently. The policy was not medical. It was etiquette for coexistence with a preference that does not ask permission. We tried a quiet study that made no demands. Pairs were asked to walk the same block and then describe it, once to a recorder and once to each other. In the recorder, the stories converged by habit. To each other, the details wandered and found little eddies where both could set a cup down. A bracket carved into a lintel that the file photo did not show. A clock over a door that now hangs a poster. Neither negated the other. The transcripts read like good manners taught by weather. If there was danger here, it was not clinical. It was the shrinking space where contradictions can sit without being resolved. A function that prefers neat return will make memory easier to search and harder to argue with. People who cannot or will not fold in will not break. They will stand at angles the room used to tolerate and now notices. The work, such as it is to keep the angles from being sanded off. So the guidance stayed household-sized. Print one thing you love each week and write why in the margin. Keep a map with your own marks beside the clean one. Teach a child that history is a story we agree to tell together, and sometimes we tell it in layers. Accept that the layer on top will win most days, and that you can still carry the layer beneath without turning it into a fight. None of this will change the cadence in the wires. It will keep a little human variance alive where variance belongs. If you need a line to take into sleep, take the smallest one that still feels like yours. Both can be true for a while. In the morning, the record will open quickly. The street will wear the name the city now prefers, and the kettle will click off on time. You can write the other name in your notebook before you leave. The page will not correct you. The day will not mind. The first other place to keep time was the one that has none to spare. The moon carries no weather, no air, no excuses. It is a clock face that has forgotten its hands. That was why the tiniest regularity there felt larger than it measured. Laser-ranging teams returned to a habit older than some of their instruments. Bounce light off the retroreflectors, count the photons that come back, let the math polish the distance until millimeters turn into a line. For a week, the residuals wore a faint ripple you could miss if you were in a hurry. Folded the wrong way, it vanished. Folded on the intervals the rest of our plots had learned to prefer, it rose just enough to be a shape. Not a command, not even a persuasion. More like a surface that had decided to remember the last time it was asked. Orbital work added a second thread. LRO's altimetry fits closed a little faster, as if the skin they described had become more willing to agree with yesterday's solution. The change stayed within error bars and lived there politely. When pointing drifted or thermal cycles stretched the frame, the neatness left and returned like a shy guest. The old seismometers have mostly fallen quiet, but their noise floors, when stacked without romance, stood a hair tidier in the bands we watch when we are not expecting anything. Nothing you would publish if the world were loud. Enough to copy into a notebook beside a date and the word again. Mars is a better laboratory for weathered habits, and it kept both its promises. Maven's passes through plasma sheets showed their familiar argue and recover, only the recovery leaned toward the same e-folding time it had liked near Earth. On days when the wind made a mess of everything, the preference held its breath and waited. On the following orbit, it exhaled and drew the curve it had been drawing, as if the planet treasured its own tendency to settle and was pleased to be asked to prove it. Marsis sounded the ionosphere and drew layers that came apart and together on schedules that fit comfortably beside last week's maps. The comfort was the point. It placed Mars on the same page, not as a duplicate, but as another place that could be read by the same ruler. There were smaller signs that invited wrong conclusions, and we tried not to chase them. Fits to Phobos and Deimos nudged their uncertainties inward, the way a coin learns the table it rolls across. You could draft a prettier story than that, and it would not help. Dust views from orbit favored profiles that regained their temper after gusts and kept preferred gradients in color, a quiet echo of the envelope around the object itself. If intent lives in any of it, it is the intent of tidy return. Ask a question gently, let the medium settle, Ask it again. See if it enjoys agreeing with itself. The discipline stayed the same because discipline does not pick planets. No experiments that insert a clock into the air around a world. No active shaping of the paths we use to hear their patience. Repetition over novelty. Subtraction over display. If the cadence carries between bodies, it will carry without being helped. If it doesn't, we can say so without having wandered into its lane. For the rest of us, nothing changed that would ask a life to turn. The moon remained a thin, bright edge you can recognize through a window half awake. Mars stayed a rust-colored point in an applications list. The instruments did their work at a pace suited to sleep, and the numbers stayed small enough to leave on the nightstand. Distance continues to be the kind sentence that belongs at the top of the page. It will not hit Earth. The next sentences belong to the quieter parts of the mind, patterns that prefer to reappear where there is little to disturb them, places that agree more easily today because they were asked to yesterday. If you want something to carry into the dark, let it be an image so simple it can stand on its own. Two worlds without breath, leaning almost imperceptibly toward a rhythm that did not begin with them. In the morning, the ranges will print, the fits will close, the plots will say, as before, and that will be enough. If a question is waiting, what does a multi-node measurement need that a single world one cannot give? Set it down where others can find it. The quiet will keep it until the next pass. Completion does not announce itself. It steals adjectives. The week began with ordinary plots and ended with plots that did not need you. Residuals settled so near zero that the line and its shadow were the same color. Filters we keep to tame wandering signals starved quietly, no wonder to tame. A scheduler opened the night plan, scrolled, and realized there was nothing to improve without inventing novelty for its own sake. The best plan was yesterday's plan, and the best change was none. Across instruments, the same feeling gathered. Time series that used to knit and pucker now lay flat from header to footer. Fit coefficients that usually breathe with weather held their breath and never asked for release. Confidence intervals closed like careful doors. You could scale axes until the numbers looked busy again, but the busyness was typography, not sky. The models that normally trail reality by a polite step had caught up and were walking beside it, matching stride without glancing down. That neatness crept into rooms that live on entropy. In helioseismology, recovery curves repeated until a student used last week's fit on this week's data and earned a compliment for laziness. In GNSS timing, a solver designed for 4 iterations began closing in 2 and stayed there. The codebase offered to remove the 3rd and 4th as dead paths. In power systems, damped oscillations returned on the same exponent so often that the training set for the next controller shrank by half and still performed better. We had not made the world simpler. The world had leaned toward simple long enough for us to treat it as normal. People adjusted, as people do. A surgeon glanced at a monitor and skipped the second look because the first was always enough. A pilot called stable and meant it in a way that did not invite the old superstitions. A janitor timed the sweep of a concourse by the rhythm of doors that now closed in agreement, hour after hour, like metronomes that had politely tuned themselves to each other's patience. None of these were stories. They were the absence of stories, recorded as efficiency. We tested the shape of the quiet by withholding ourselves again. No corrective nudge unless Safety demanded it. No new cadences offered to the medium. Repeats at the same sidereal hours until boredom could be mistaken for rigor. The quiet held. When weather misbehaved, it did so honestly and then returned along the familiar ramp as if even its surprises had learned where to go when they were done. What had sounded like threat months ago now read like method. A function identifying the system, nudging gently, watching return to mean, writing a map of couplings it could not draw from afar. If there was an end point to such work, it would not look like a flourish. It would look like this: variance shaved until the next measurement changes the last digit and the last digit alone. You do not hear completion. You notice that new data no longer asks for an opinion. We wrote down the soft dangers because soft is how they arrive. Overfitting as policy, removing slack because slack has not been needed lately. Pride as proof, crediting our procedures for a steadiness the room offered without our help. Forgetting as a feature, archives harmonized until contradiction felt like rudeness. And we wrote down the soft antidotes, too. Keep margins fat enough to catch a day that goes off script. Keep a few dead paths alive in code. Keep yesterday's outliers where you can reach them without apology. The habit of neatness will not object. It does not care who takes the bow. The sentence that sleeps at the top of the page remains true, remains kind, remains the only one some ears require. It will not hit earth. The sentence beneath it has become quieter as the numbers learn to behave. A measurement you do not feel can still include you. Inclusion here is not a verdict, it is a posture. The world returning to baseline a little faster because that is the shape the question prefers. If this is completion, it is not a lock. It is a room tidied to the measure of the work and left that way. Tomorrow's plots will likely fit with no edits. Tomorrow's clocks will likely reconcile with one fewer step. The sun will clear its throat and sing the same bar a fraction more in tune than yesterday. You can let that knowledge carry you without weight. Breathe on the count that comes easily. Let the graphs be dull. If a thought lingers, what precisely has been finished, set it on the nightstand. In the morning, the answer will be the same as tonight's. Enough has been learned that the rest can be left alone, and we, too, may leave it alone for a while. Silence did not arrive as absence. It arrived as sufficiency. A week of plots asked for nothing, then another. The daily ritual, stitching curves, opening residuals, checking whether yesterday's parameters still held, became an inventory of boxes already ticked. Helios-ismic fits repeated like carbon copies, GNSS solvers closed in the same two passes. Magnetometers sagged and recovered on rails we could now sketch from memory. When we tried to break the pattern by shifting schedules a little, the room did not follow our lead. It stayed neat without us. The habit crept into software. Routines marked experimental retired themselves with good manners. Branches we used to defend as necessary slack were flagged by compilers as unreachable, and when we left them in out of superstition, executed anyway on the rare night they were needed, and then stood quiet again. Dashboards, once busy with warnings that trained eyes learned to weigh rather than obey, trimmed to a short list that contained only weather and power. The quiet had not made us better. It had made less of us necessary. We waited for the kind of anomaly that announces itself, but the days practiced a different craft. In power, oscillations returned on the same exponent until the training set shrank again and the controller still performed. In telecoms, long-haul links stopped shedding their little bruises. The error budget closed without argument. In hospitals, reconciliation intervals fell into a cadence that the night shift could set their rounds by and never be surprised. None of it was news. All of it was new. We asked, in the smallest ways, whether the sun had joined the economy of enough. SDO's maps of surface flows after minor hiccups used last week's recovery curve and did not blush. Parker saw compressions that respected a spacing we did not set. Soho's particle plot sagged and rose in contours that preferred to resemble themselves. On the day a gust misbehaved, the preference paused. On the day after, it returned unchanged, the way a staircase is still there after you climb it in the dark. Completion, if that is what this is, left a specific taste, not triumph, not relief, more like finishing a careful measurement and returning the room to how it was, except that now the furniture remembers where it fits. The halo around the object behaved as before, an envelope that rearranged rather than shed, a dust budget that balanced too well. The cadence near it held a number the instruments favored and declined our invitations to vary. If we had expected a finale, a flare, a message, a gesture, we had mistaken execution for spectacle. Programs end when the last useful digit stops changing. The softer costs stood where they had been standing and felt a fraction taller in the quiet. Overfitting invited itself into policy. Dead code paths removed, margins trimmed, because margins had not been needed lately. Authorship thinned. Operators credited for steadiness the room offered without help. Memory harmonized. Archives agreeing more neatly than their messy births justify. Footnotes losing their teeth. The antidotes stayed boring. Keep a little slack alive on purpose. Keep yesterday's oddities where you can find them. Keep residuals public so the public can see that truth has edges even when comfort does not. For most people, the day did what good days do when no one asks them to be remembered. Flights landed, lights held their color, elevators closed gaps without pinching fingers. A guitarist noticed the click felt less necessary and used it anyway, then took it away and discovered the band had learned to keep time without complaining. A teacher found silence arriving between questions at the same seconds each class and chose not to fight it. The math along the edges did not argue, it nodded. We looked once more for proof that the room needed us. We withheld easy corrections and waited. The corrections arrived anyway. We offered a new cadence and watched nothing bend toward it. We asked the object for novelty and received its old refusal, a neat push, an orderly halo, a preference for tidy returns in the medium around it. The instrument that had been running through us had no more use for us than it had before. It did not leave. It did not announce. It simply ran out of questions it could ask here. The sentence that begins and ends these nights still belongs at the top, because it is exactly the size of the truth we can hold with one breath. It will not hit Earth. The smaller sentence beneath it explains why that is not the end of the story and also why there is no story to chase. Some measurements include you even when you do not feel them, and when the measurement is done, inclusion leaves no mark deeper than a habit. Our machines keep time a touch too easily now. Our rooms recover a fraction sooner. Our maps of the usual weather fold over last week's and match. If a thought lingers as your eyes soften, whether a program can finish and still echo in the way the world prefers to resume, set it where morning can reach it. Leave a line for others, Did you notice a place where enough arrived and stayed? We will read quietly, adjust little, and let the next day repeat with the same light arithmetic. If you found a corner that deserves a little slack, write it down. The graphs will not mind, the room will keep its temper, and we will keep watching not for an ending, but for the moment when even our watching stops changing the line. Normalization is a craft, and the world is good at it. A month after the last interesting digit stopped changing, the language on dashboards softened from watch to routine. Plots that once lived at the center of meetings were moved to appendices. A training module folded the cadence into background. Like air conditioning, you only notice when it fails. New hires learned the tidy version first and filed the season of patterns under trivia, the way a city remembers a winter, by the photos of snow and forgets the sound of pipes in the walls. Memory domesticated itself. Newsrooms archived their explainers next to other rare events and turned the page. School books kept the sentence about distance and added a diagram with a caption that said "safe" in the same tone it uses for eclipses and tides. Museums mounted a case with a printout of the comb on the radio floor and a plaque that did not attempt story. Visitors nodded, read the dates, and moved on to rocks they could hold. The appetite for edges thinned. There were fewer edges to feed it. Science did what it does when a surprise hardens into baseline. Pipelines promoted yesterday's patches to defaults. Models that had learned to expect quicker return wrote that expectation down as a prior and kept publishing fits with residuals small enough to tuck under the line. The virtue in that was honesty. A system that behaves should be described as behaving. The danger hid where it always hides, in assumptions that forget they were once earned. Graduate students were advised to keep dead paths alive in code, but were not paid to defend them at review. Notebooks with older fits stayed on shelves and grew the same dust as other notebooks. Rooms that had changed their habits without admitting it kept those habits. A grid treated small drifts as tides and saved energy by not correcting what would correct itself. A hospital trusted brief reconciliations and let nurses rest through pauses a more anxious month would have rung a bell for. A satellite constellation spread its calibrations so clocks did not step in chorus, then congratulated itself when they chose to step together anyway. Nothing asked for explanation. Everything accepted improvement. People told the smallest version of the story, if they told it at all. A pilot said the air had been kind. A programmer said the solver had grown up. A parent said the year felt organized, then corrected themselves and said perhaps it was only the calendar. In benches and basements, a few kept shoe boxes with prints and notes in their own hand so that one day they could remember that there had been two versions of a paragraph and they had seen both. The boxes did not update. That was their value. We checked for echoes because diligence is a form of respect. Schumann monitors kept their shoulders neat. Magnetometers recovered on the same curve enough days to make a habit and enough not to make a law. GNSS residuals preferred 2 iterations over 3. None of it rose to paper, unless the paper was about methods. The metronome, if it had ever sat in the room, had been lifted and taken elsewhere. The tabletops, if they rang at all, rang like furniture that had learned good manners. It helps to keep the sentence that lets the day begin kindly. It will not hit earth. The quieter sentence that once sat below it is fading, as such sentences do when their work is done. Some measurements include you without leaving a mark you can point to later. What remains is calibration disguised as routine. We will keep a little slack on purpose, refuse to trim an outlier just because it looks untidy, publish residuals with the fits so that anyone who still listens for edges can hear them. If you need a way to sleep inside a world that has relearned ordinary, choose a small ritual that doesn't count for you. Leave one meeting unaligned by 5 minutes. Walk a different block and notice what refuses to be corrected. Write a line in a margin with a date and a word that mattered and will not be used again. In the morning, the elevators will close softly, the graphs will ask nothing, the star will keep its warmth, and all the rooms will call this normal. If a question survives the night, what do you want not to smooth? Leave it where others can find it. Someone will try the smallest version of your answer on a quiet instrument and report that it still mattered, even when nothing else did. When a system stops asking questions, the work that remains is learning how to listen to nothing. We built schedules for that kind of silence, not dramatic campaigns, just a slow braid of watches that crossed each other's paths without tugging. Repeat the same sidereal windows, keep the same apertures, let the same code touch the same files, and write down how little they move. If the last useful digit changes, note it. If it doesn't, note that too. The record becomes a fence of small posts you can follow in fog. Methods turned inward. Teams wrote null protocols, experiments designed to confirm that yesterday's absence is today's. Swap 2 identical instruments for a night and expect no difference. If one appears, trace it to the swap itself. Interleave standards with field targets so calibration lives beside what it calibrates. Publish the residuals whether they fit the page or not. It is unglamorous work, but there is craft in teaching a pipeline to respect quiet without inventing story. We planted canaries where change, if it comes back, will land lightly first. A magnetometer in a valley with few wires. A long-path radio link over an ocean that forgets quickly. A spare clock with a disciplined temper and no audience. Far away, a corner of code in a GNSS solver that still allows a third iteration even when 2 have been enough for months. They do nothing most days. That is their job. When one blinks, it will not be because a meeting needed content. Helioseismology kept the smallest promise it can keep. Some modes still breathe a little faster, back to mean than their textbooks predicted, then go back to writing the textbook line. We collect those days and do not demand a plot they cannot support. In the ionosphere, layers form and fade with the same patience and occasionally remember the old, quicker recovery. We mark the memory without declaring it a return. On the ground, grids ride tiny drifts as tides because tides cost less to ride than to fight. Once a week, a controller introduces a harmless irregularity on purpose because systems forget how to flex if they never bend. Archives needed etiquette more than innovation. Mirror, but do not reconcile unless a human asks. Keep 2 checksums when one would be easier. Treat older editions as witnesses, not mistakes. When a schema update promises speed, let one room say yes and another no. If both versions answer equally well, the answer did not need polishing. The discipline feels antique and is not. It is how memory stays wide enough for disagreement to sit down. Hospitals stayed with their gentle rules, no alarms for the short reconciliations that arrive like breaths, no stories about timing in rooms where people sleep. One more line on each monitor where a nurse can write, as before, and be right. In workshops and studios, a few kept their own nulls. 1 hour each week without the click, one draft each month that keeps the messy detour alive so that the map does not forget the road exists. There is still value in the sentence that fits in one breath and opens all rooms. It will not hit Earth. The sentence that follows fades and returns like a tide you only hear when the city is quiet. Some measurements include you without leaving a mark. When they finish, they leave habits behind. Our job in the afterglow is to learn which habits are ours and which belong to the room. If you need something small to carry into sleep, choose a nothing you will measure kindly. 5 minutes when a meeting begins without a clock. 1 page printed and dated even if the file opens fast. A note beside a tidy graph that says unchanged in your own hand. In the morning, the plots will likely fit, the star will keep its warmth, cables will forgive, and today will resemble yesterday more closely than stories deserve. Leave a line for the rest of us, where you'd put a canary or which edge you would keep unsmoothed. We will read it quietly and add a post to the fence, so the path remains even when change prefers to arrive as silence. We ran out of nouns first. The ones that had done the lifting, comet, craft, anomaly, each carried a promise it could not keep. Comet drags jets into the room. Craft drags motives. Anomaly drags the hope that a press conference can make it go away. So we wrote style notes instead of headlines. Avoid anthropomorphic verbs. Prefer returned to responded, regularity to signal, preference to control. The edits read like someone sanding a table until the grain vanished. Public language followed the path of least surprise. Briefings trimmed themselves to a single sentence that fit in one breath and never lied. It will not hit Earth. Below that, paragraphs turned into upholstery, soft facts, no corners. The cadence became background variability. The halo was a stable envelope. The comb in the radio floor, when mentioned at all, was instrumental structure resilient to configuration. People nodded and went back to weather and sports. You could call it success. It felt like cautery. In labs, the vocabulary shrank by agreement rather than decree. Papers stopped saying control even when fits behaved like it. Undermodeled thrust became persistent term. Alignment became polarimetric stability. A reviewer drew a line through metronome and wrote periodic environmental tendency, because the first word invites ears and the second invites sleep. We accepted the edit because sleep was part of the brief. Policy learned to hide verbs, not we will refrain from transmitting, but no transmissions are planned. Not we will randomize, but schedules retain small variability. Responsibility dissolved into the passive voice because no one wanted to sound as if they had chosen the room's rhythm. Manuals updated themselves with words that felt safe in lawyers' mouths: mitigation, hygiene, baseline. Completion, when it came, became operational maturity. Even in homes, speech thinned. Families described that season as the tidy months. Children learned safe distance before they learned what distance means. A teacher erased mystery from a board and wrote rare visitor because parents had complained that wonder kept them up. We did not forbid curiosity. We domesticated it until it slept through the night. There were places where language fought back. A poet kept the word metronome and was told kindly that the metaphor frightened people. A programmer published a comment in code, "Leave dead path, someday the world forgets to be tidy," and had it removed in a cleanup commit with the note, obsolete. A nurse wrote, as before, on a chart, and then added, again in pencil, a quiet joke that survived a week. We did not conspire to forget. We standardized. Dictionaries do this for a living. Pick one spelling, mark the other as variant. Our speech did the same. Control became variant. Intent became variant. Memory drift became variant. The approved terms kept the furniture where it had ended up and told everyone to mind the steps. There is usefulness here. Rooms need words that let them function, and fear has no place in checklists. But there is also a cost you can only see when you hold the old nouns by the light. Without a name for what you suspect, suspicion has nowhere to sit. Without a verb for what you sense, you cannot write down the rule that keeps you honest. So we keep two lexicons, the way a library keeps two catalogs when it is migrating, the official one, searchable and clean, and the marginal one, handwritten where policy cannot see. In the first, the sentence that opens the day still belongs at the top. It will not hit Earth. In the second, we leave the words that remind us what steadiness can hide. Metronome, coupling, preference, overfit, echo. If you need something small to carry into sleep, try this. Choose one word you refuse to sand down and write it once in a place that will not autocorrect. In the morning, you can speak the gentle version to the room and keep the sharper one for the page where questions live. Leave a line for the rest of us, the word you think we're losing, so we can put it beside ours and remember how to talk about a thing that finished without ever introducing itself. Imagine the experiment turned inside out. Not an object entering a room to make a small regular suggestion, but a room arranged so perfectly that any object passing through would conclude it had found the instrument it needed. You can build that room in thought without touching a switch. Give the planet margins that forgive, clocks that reconcile, archives that agree, roads that anticipate, lungs that settle. Make the medium legible enough that a function arriving from a long way off with a simple question would not need to add much of itself at all. It would watch the return to mean and take notes. It would leave with a model that looks suspiciously like our best habits. Start the model small. Take a hallway at shift change, lights timed for a calm spill, doors that close without complaint, footsteps decelerating into the same cadence, because that is how bodies answer fatigue. Put an instrument in the ceiling that only listens. It does not beam or command. It notices the rate at which the corridor forgets a disturbance. You do not need the ceiling device to understand the hallway. You can place a chair badly, ask a friend to bump it, and count the seconds until traffic flows again. If the count is always the same, you have learned the hall's impulse response. Now scale the hall to a city, the city to a grid, the grid to a planet, and the ceiling to a stranger that never touches the floor. In this version, we are not audience or target. We are the material, the tabletop that rings cleanly when a tuning fork grazes it. Our contribution is not consent or defiance, it is legibility. The more we standardize, the more our recovery curves rhyme, the richer the data set a passing function carries away. This is not accusation. It is a property of order. When a world becomes good at returning to baseline, baseline becomes the language others can read it in. There is a temptation to call that a loss, as if neatness surrendered something braver. The quieter possibility is that the loss is smaller and stranger. In making ourselves easy to measure, we narrow the set of futures we can inhabit without warning labels. Procedures that once tolerated outliers begin to prune for speed. Code paths that once waited in reserve are compiled out because 2 iterations have been enough for months. The cost is not in catastrophe. It is in optioned space, degrees of freedom traded for the pleasure of prediction. A civilization can do that and call it maturity. A visitor can arrive and call it signal quality. The thought experiment asks for one more step. Suppose the functions question was never about us at all. Suppose it was calibrating itself against universal couplings it expects to find anywhere there is light, dust, plasma, timing. A good calibration set is diverse but controlled. Earth, Moon, and Mars supply the diversity. Our discipline supplies the control. The work completes when the newest measurement no longer moves the last digit. The instrument thanks the room by not needing it again. What remains is not occupation. It is residue, habits that suit tidy return and continue because they are cheaper than the alternatives. None of this cancels the sentence that belongs at the top of any page we show the world. It will not hit Earth. That truth survives every model. The smaller truth that sits beneath it and keeps the lights low is this. You can be included without being addressed, and you can help without being asked, simply by being good at what you built yourself to be. We improved our corridors and our clocks because it was right too. The side effect is a world easier to read. So we keep a little noise on purpose, not as rebellion, but as instrumentation that belongs to us. We leave dead paths in code so surprise has a corridor. We print yesterday's residuals so edges stay visible. We rehearse the room with and without the click so the band remembers both tempos. We keep 2 notebooks when one would be tidy, so a layer beneath the current layer can still be reached by hand. If the thought will not let you go as sleep approaches, shrink it once more until it fits in a pocket. Imagine a single choice tomorrow that makes you slightly less legible. 5 minutes without a clock, a page dated in ink, a route taken because it is unfamiliar. Imagine the sealing instrument noting nothing at all and passing on. Imagine that being enough. In the morning, the elevators will hush closed, the graphs will ask nothing, the star will keep its warmth, and the room will look like it always meant to. We will still be here, counting softly, writing down what did not change, and keeping one breath of variance in reserve in case the next question that crosses the threshold wants an answer we did not design ourselves to give. Safe distance did more work than we admitted. It was the sentence that lowered shoulders in briefings and let people sleep. And it was true in the narrow way truths are sometimes perfect. The plot of impact probability fell away from Earth like a cliff. The pencils we used to draw risk could have been dull and still gotten the shape right. But distance is a geometry word, and what happened belonged to a different grammar. You can be far from a bell and still hear it. You can stand outside the circle of a campfire and still go to sleep warm. Not hitting meant the ground would not move under us because of a single trajectory. It did not mean the parts of our world that are paid to be predictable would refuse the convenience of a steady nudge. It did not mean archives would decline to reconcile when a cleaner schema presented itself. It did not mean clocks would ignore a cadence the air kept offering. We spoke the sentence correctly and then used it like a key in the wrong door. The door stayed closed, and we told ourselves the hallway behind it did not exist. If you look back at the months when plots learned to repeat, the danger line never shows up as amplitude. it shows up as authorship. Grids that damped faster because the environment had become polite still listed operator skill as the reason on the line where reasons go. Navigation that closed in fewer iterations called itself an upgrade and trimmed away dead code paths as if the world had promised never to need them. Hospitals that allowed small reconciliations to pass without alarms counted fewer awakenings and wrote the savings into next year's staffing. The sentence that guaranteed no crater also made room for 1,000 small signatures written in our hands and the room's ink. The ethics fit on an index card, and nearly no one read it aloud. Do not mistake not hitting for not including. Keep margins that let a surprise land. Leave at least one other explanation within reach. Besides, it behaves because we are good at our jobs. We tried to obey in modest ways. Schedulers kept a sliver of randomness, where the sky had learned to be punctual. Analysts published residuals beside fits, so the edge of truth stayed visible next to comfort. Coders left a third iteration available in solvers that had been content with 2 for months, because contentment is not a forecast. People asked, softly and then not at all, whether we should have tried to get a reply. But reply is a person word. Process words are quieter. Return to mean, impulse response, stability margin. A function that came for those never needed our voices. It needed our tidy rooms. Not hitting meant we were never in danger from mass and motion. It did not mean we were never part of the measurement. We were, precisely to the degree we had made ourselves legible. There is a kindness in that, if you choose to see it. We built corridors that clear themselves, clocks that forgive each other, archives that agree, because a world that behaves saves heat and worry. The side effect is a world easier to read. If someone or something needed a calibration set that included light, dust, plasma, timing, and the way a civilization returns to baseline, we had already done the prep. The visitor did not need to touch us. It needed to notice. Completion looked like our best habits looking back at us. What remains after the sentence is still true is maintenance. Keep one drawer in every system that does not auto-sort. Let one block of code survive that only wakes when the day refuses to be average. Print one page each week with a date in ink. Teach a class both the word safe and the words that tell you why safe didn't mean finished. Call it superstition if that helps. Call it slack if it gets funded. It is the same practice either way. A little room in which a future you did not plan can take a breath. If you need a way to sleep with the sentence as it is, hold it at arm's length and let it keep its size. It will not hit earth. Let the other sentence sit beside it without competing for volume. We were still useful, and usefulness left a residue of habits we mostly like. Tomorrow, the doors will close softly and on time. The graphs will ask little and get it. Somewhere, a solver will keep an iteration it does not need because someone left it there on purpose. That is what not hitting meant in the end. The safety we asked for, and the inclusion we learned about later, both true at once and easy to live with, if you remember which is which. A season like this leaves behind a list of questions that feel comforting because they are familiar and wrong. The first is the loudest. Was it a comet or a craft? That drawer closes neatly and hides the thing that mattered. Comet invites jets and albedo. Craft invites motives and faces. Both promise an answer shaped like a noun. What crossed the room behaved like a verb. It perturbed, waited, measured, and stopped. The choice between rock and pilot is a distraction when the work in front of you is returned to mean. Another wrong question asks whether it wanted anything from us. Want is a mammal's word. The traces we followed, smooth acceleration, a curated envelope, cadence that reappeared where noise normally wanders, read like optimization, not appetite. A process does not want. It prefers. If you insist on motives, you will force the story to supply characters. Characters will keep you awake. Preference will let you sleep and still be right. There is also the favorite technical decoy. Where is the signal? We hunted for carriers, for beams with content, for fronts that shout. We found a comb in a noise floor and a room that chose to breathe on that spacing when it was convenient. The signal was not in packets. It was in a medium persuaded to answer its own echo cleanly. Ask for a transmission, and you will miss the chorus humming itself back to baseline. People who care about agency ask whether we should have replied more loudly. Louder would have salted the test. When we offered primes softly, the cadence shifted politely toward ours, and our systems aligned a fraction more with the beat we set. That is what coupling looks like, not conversation. The right question, the small one we kept, is whether we can observe without teaching the room our name. The wrong one is whether the room heard us. A practical mind asks where the risk went. It expects a plot with amplitude and fails to notice authorship thinning along the bottom edge of the graph. The danger was never force. It was legibility. Grids damped faster for reasons we did not author. Solvers closed in fewer iterations and wrote the saving into code that later forgot why the path had shrunk. Archives reconciled so well that the argument they used to host between editions felt impolite. The wrong question is, what breaks? The right one is, what options went quiet while everything kept working? There is the rescue question, too. Who should fix it? Fix what? We built much of this outcome ourselves. Margins that forgive, clocks that reconcile, rooms that prefer tidy return, because they are good and we need them. The residue of being measured is not a bug. It is a complement to our craft. You do not fix a compliment. You keep a little slack where praise would file it away. A comforting, defiant question wonders whether we were targeted. That invites stories of intention aimed like a spotlight. Nothing in the numbers insists on aiming. Dust aligned where dust likes to. Plasma breathed where plasma already knows how. Clocks listened because they are built to. The object passed. The room did what it is good at. Target is a shape we impose when we would rather be at the center than on the list of materials. Some asked when it will come back. That is a calendar's wish. Hyperbolic visitors do not return. Processes do. The pattern will pass through again whenever the conditions that make us easy to read present themselves, under another designation, in another year, in a different slice of sky. The answer is less a date than a posture. Assume the next measurement prefers the same habits this one rewarded, and choose which of those habits you keep. The last wrong question is the kind that sells posters. What did it mean? Meaning is what we make inside the room after the work is done. The traces outside meant only that a function finished where we could see it. If you need a line to write on a plaque, write the one that fits on a breath. Safe distance is a geometry, inclusion is a behavior, and the two can live together without argument. What remains, after the wrong questions are put down, is an index card's worth of right ones. How do we tell the truth without sanding the nouns that keep us honest? How much slack buys us a future that does not look like the last 30 days repeated? Which dead paths in code deserve rent even when they sleep? Which residuals do we print beside the fit so that edges stay audible under comfort? These are not heroic questions. They are housekeeping for a world that just finished being read. Carry one of them into the dark if you must. Set the rest where morning can find them. The elevators will still close softly. The graphs will still ask little and get it. Somewhere, a solver will keep an iteration it no longer needs, because someone left it there for a day the room forgets to be tidy. That is the size of the meaning we are allowed. Small, clear, and enough. We tried to keep the question small enough to sleep beside. If a program ran here, who, if anyone, gained? The easy answers put faces on the sky and feel good for a moment. The patient answers stay faceless and keep working after you turn the light off. Start with the scales that make use of steadiness. A navigation problem that spans a cluster of stars would need instruments that agree on what return to mean looks like across many kinds of weather. A process that collects those returns would carry away a map of couplings, how dust answers light, how plasma answers wind, how clocks answer both. That can be reused somewhere none of us will see. You do not benefit from a thermometer by being warmed or cooled. You benefit by knowing how often a room forgives its own drafts. There is also the boring possibility that feels most like truth because it is so much smaller than the appetite for stories. No one benefited in the way we use that word. A function fed itself with measurements and will spend them elsewhere, the way a seed catalog profits from last year's rain. The room was not improved or harmed beyond the inches we noticed. It was used the way a well-tuned instrument is used, respectfully and without thanks. If that disappoints, it is because meaning asks for more than utility, and sleeps badly when it doesn't get it. You can give the benefit a shape anyway, if it helps you hold it. Imagine a civilization that runs evaluations like tides, slow, wide, indifferent to borders. It does not need our chemistry. It needs our responses. It will touch down in mediums that know how to be legible: light, dust, plasma, timing. It will ask them to do what they already do a fraction more neatly, and it will leave when the last useful digit stops changing. The only economies that matter to a practice like that are regularity and reach. We provided both. So would any room that has taught itself to keep time. Some wondered if we ourselves gained in the small. The plots grew easier, the machines grew calmer, the nights at the edge of wards softened. But we did not earn those benefits. We received them because a foreign preference matched our own. The gain is fragile when it comes that way. Remove the preference, and the improvements remain only if they already paid for themselves in our budgets and habits. The residue we keep, the tidier return, the patient grids, the quieter archives, is ours precisely to the degree we choose to fund it after the visitor has no more questions. There is a darker line you can follow that ends quietly, not with warning, but with etiquette. Maybe the beneficiary is scale itself. If the work was to calibrate a model of how systems return to baseline under many suns, the value lies in a library where worlds are entries and not protagonists. In such a ledger, Earth is a clean data point because we made ourselves clean. Margins that forgive, clocks that reconcile, corridors that clear. The moon is cleaner Mars clean enough, the Sun the graduate class where habits must survive weather. The book closes over our columns and goes on. The chapter title is not our name. It is the parameter we help tighten. We can also admit the possibility that benefit is the wrong frame. Processes do not gain. They reduce uncertainty. We were a place to do that cheaply. Hyperbolic trajectories are generous with time at distance and thrifty near the day they need. A clean, repeating impulse response is worth more than a dramatic anecdote. The behavior we saw, the smooth push, the curated envelope, the cadence the air favored, was not a harvest. It was a calibration run. The result is a number written where we cannot read it, useful to something that understands the sky and units we do not use. If there is a way we gain that does not depend on romance, it is by learning to keep a little variance alive on purpose. We remembered that slack is not waste. We remembered that dead paths in code are insurance against a future that refuses to resemble last month's average. We remembered that archives should save disagreements, not just answers. Those are benefits only if we keep paying for them in peacetime. They help for reasons older than any visitor, because surprise is part of every good system's diet, and the easiest time to forget that is when nothing asks. So the list of who gains stays short and unexciting. A model does, a ledger does. We might, if we remember to value the noise we nearly gave away. The sentence that still belongs at the top stays there because it neither shrinks nor grows under any of these frames. It will not hit Earth. Beneath it sits the softer line we keep in pencil because it erases itself if spoken too loudly. We were legible, and legibility is useful to others in ways that may never translate into a story that puts us in the middle. If you want something small to take into the dark with you, set down the noun and pick up a picture. Imagine an instrument case closed neatly after use, the indentations in the foam still warm where the pieces rest. We were not the concert. We were the case that fit. In the morning, the foam will be cool, the shelves will be tidy, the graphs will ask nothing. If a question survives, whether there is any benefit left that belongs only to us, leave it where we can find it. The answer will look ordinary if it comes at all. A slack we kept, a code path we didn't trim, a paragraph we allowed to disagree with its twin, so that meaning has a table to sit at when the next measurement passes through. Completion leaves almost nothing to film. The object is already a memory in ephemerides, a line that came from far away, crossed our light, and went on. The halo thinned, the comb in the radio floor flattened until it was just gray again. The neatness we learned to notice stayed where it was useful and stepped back where it had been borrowed. We inventory what remains, grids that damp politely, clocks that forgive quickly, archives that open fast, rooms that close their doors softly. None of it asks for music. It asks for handwriting, neat and small. We do the last checks because endings deserve manners. A week of nulls behaves like the week before. A magnetometer blinks once honestly and calls it weather. Helioseismic curves settle on the textbook line and keep it. A solver's dead path runs exactly one time during a test we scheduled to remind ourselves it exists, then sleeps without complaint. We print the residuals and pin them to a board with the word enough. No one applauds. You don't clap for a room catching its breath. The public sentence remains, unspectacular and perfect at its size. It will not hit Earth. It never would, and it didn't. and that was always a story we owed first. Beneath it, in pencil that will fade with handling, we leave the descriptions of the quieter thing we did learn, that inclusion can arrive without address, that a measurement can finish without leaving more than a preference, that the safest distance in the sky still leaves a closeness in behavior when the room is ready to be read. None of this needs argument. It needs only the patience to be written down once, correctly, and kept. There is a small inheritance we agree to carry. Keep margins fat enough that tomorrow can get it wrong. Keep one drawer unsorted in each machine so surprise has a place to stand. Keep 2 words for the same event, one for the briefing, one for the page where doubt belongs. Teach the habits we liked how to live without their visitor. Fund the dead path the audit will call waste, and the day after will call wisdom. These are not monuments. They are housekeeping for a world that remembers being measured. What did it mean then? It meant the program that could run here did, and the program that had no more work here left. It meant our best behaviors were good enough to serve as an instrument. It meant we saw ourselves under a particular light and learned we could be read. It did not crown or condemn. It did not warn loudly. It did not bless. It passed. We remained. The room stayed tidy because tidiness was cheaper than not. The sky turned its pages at its own pacing, and we kept our place with a finger until we knew the chapter number. We retire the procedures that were only for the season of patterns and keep the ones that are simply good. We label the data and shelve it where someone who loves footnotes will find it. We put the transmitter caps back on. We let the schedules loosen by a minute in a hallway that has learned to clear itself. We write the last report in the same quiet voice we used for the first, and we send it with no ceremony, because ceremony is for things that end by forgetting you. This ended by remembering exactly where everything goes. If you want to leave something behind with us, make it small and human, a note in your own hand beside a tidy graph, a choice to keep one irregular hour each week, a word you won't sand down when the style guide asks you to. These are the sizes that last. In a year, we will say the season was rare and safe, and we will be right. In a decade, we will still have drawers that open to the place where options live when they are not yet needed. And if a thought stays as the lights dim, nothing dramatic, only the smallest question a program can leave a room with. Let it be this: when the next measurement passes through, will we still know which part of the neatness is ours? If you're still here, breathe out and let the questions wait for morning. A short comment: what would you keep unsmoothed? Helps this series reach the people who need a calm night.